Hey Adam, what's going on?
Dave Sanders, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good, dude. So
Good, good.
I gotta tell you, I I've been wanting to do this for probably 3 or 4 months with you to sit down and have this conversation because you're somewhat of peculiar in the sense that you went from like never a Mormon at all, and you like skipped that LDS phase and you just
Yeah,
went straight for fundamentalism,
yeah,
right? Um, which in some ways I'm guessing probably has some benefit, right? You don't have to untrain old habits or something like that,
right.
right? But at the same time, I mean, dude, you went right from dry land to the deep end of the pool. I mean, there was no
Yeah,
screwing around for you.
yeah.
So real quick, tell everyone kind of where you're from, maybe your spiritual or religious background. Let's get the full story of who you are, because I feel like it's your story, and I want to get it told because I think there's a lot of things here that's going to resonate with some people.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm flattered that you have had the desire to talk to me, but I also partially think you're nuts because I feel like I'm really boring. But that said, it is like statistically, it's an unusual story. You don't find a lot of people in fundamentalism that sort of fit this profile. But that's kind of the shame of it in my mind. If we were doing our part as servants of the Lord to broadcast this message to the audience that needed it most in a way that was effective for them to hear it, I think my story would be super boring and you'd never have any interest in interviewing me because you'd be like, okay, well, this is kind of how everybody gets into this. So I would just start with that. Now, as far as the background goes, I was I was born and raised outside of Chicago. I come from a real blue collar kind of a place. I was raised in a family that
Wait. Are you a Bears fan?
no, I was.
Oh,
Um,
good. I'm glad
yeah,
you gave that up. That's a
no,
whole.
I was. I just don't really watch football that much anymore. But the
Okay, fair enough.
McCaskey family were just so frustrating in their ownership that I gave up on it eventually. Yeah,
Attaboy.
I
Attaboy.
couldn't do it.
There's always room here if you want to be a cheesehead. I'm saying I got room. You can just jump on this wagon. It's good.
Yeah, there's probably very few things that see like I can't help myself
Right.
in terms of like my ingrained childhood prejudices. And
Sure.
so like if I was gonna smack the end button on this conference call, it would be you trying to convince me to be a Packers fan. So maybe we should just move past that. But
We'll move
I was
past that.
raised
Fair.
I was I was raised in what I like to call, so you know how there's like Jewish people and then there's like ethnically Jewish people that are not necessarily practicing Jewish people. I
Yeah.
like to call my family that I was raised in ethnically Catholic. So we
Okay.
were Catholic, but like not really. Like we would go to church on holidays and whenever grandma was in town. And we did so in Mormonism, right? We call the breaking of the bread and the blessing of the wine, or the blessing and breaking of the bread and the wine, the sacrament. In Catholicism, there are 7 sacraments, and you sort of methodically go through most of them. You can't really go through. I mean, I guess you could go through all of them, but like one of them is being ordained a priest. The other one is getting married. And in Catholicism, those two things are generally incompatible. So most people never actually get all 7. But so we would go through the sacraments, what in Mormonism we would call ordinances. We would go to church on holidays and when grandma was in town. And, very rarely my mom would just be overcome with guilt about something. And so we'd go to confession. And that was about it. And for the most part, and that sounds like a lot, but like if you're a Catholic, you're a real like true blue Catholic. That's like the bare minimum to even pretend to be one. And my dad never went. So my dad never went to church. It was only my mom and my grandmother. And that was kind of the bulk of my religious upbringing. When I was 16, that would have been in 2005. That was around the time that like new atheism was like, sort of like trendy and
Yep.
uh like subversive, and it was like the thing that you did if you were a contrarian. And so I read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins.
Uh-huh.
And then I remember I told my mom, I was like, I don't believe in God. This stuff's not real anymore. And she, cried, and despite having never really brought us to church. And so then from there until the beginning of a profound and complex conversion experience, I was just generally irreligious. Like I kind of sort of vacillated back and forth between the idea that maybe God is real, maybe God is not, but I didn't have much of like a backing. I didn't have much foundation. I had no firm foundation, certainly.
Sure.
My philosophy of anything, see, I I try to be a very thoughtful person. And so my question then was like, if God's not real, what should I be doing with my time? And so I ended up at this kind of like, call it fun nihilism, almost like not ultra hedonistic, because I recognize that people that were just super hedonistic generally descended into personal chaos and sadness
Right.
and depravity. But I had this idea that, those things that were enjoyable, without like serious repercussions, like obviously you can't, drink 30 beers without feeling like hell the next day. But those things that were generally enjoyable must be good. And those things that were generally unenjoyable must be bad, with maybe the exception of, physical fitness, right? Working out sucks, but we know we're supposed to do it from an evolutionary perspective. And so that was kind of like my mentality about right and wrong until I got on this path, which we can get there. So
Yeah. Well, let me ask a couple questions here real quick. What was your experience like when you were going to church as a young man on those rare occasions? Like when your mom, you said when your mom was overridden with guilt and she's like,
yeah,
everybody's going to confession, jump
yeah,
in the
yeah,
car.
yeah.
What, did you enjoy that at all? I mean,
No,
okay.
no, no. So I, I love my parents deeply. I don't say anything that I'm about to say with any real disparagement. It's just an honest assessment and analysis of the context in which we were brought up. But I never had, I never had a firm backing. I was never grounded in the reasons why these sacraments, or what we might call ordinances in Mormonism, were important, or why church was important. I used to sort of think of God as kind of just like this uh petty hall monitor that was constantly interrogating your thoughts all the time. Because I mean, in Catholicism, one of the things that you hear is that not only are we all sinners, but we're sort of all mortal sinners, right? Like we're kind of all just right on the brink of going to hell constantly. Like in Catholicism, hell is eternal damnation. I mean, you might, go to confession and then most people will wind up in purgatory. But I mean, like in Catholicism, the general teaching, and I don't know if this is the actual, like if this is in the catechism of the Catholic Church, but the general cultural understanding was you're sort of on the brink of going to hell all the time, even when you're a young child. And that's a weird that's a weird way of thinking about your relationship to God. And it also is a very heavy burden if you're a young child that recognizes that that's a really bad place to which I do not want to go. But also, I don't have as much control over my actions and thoughts as I would like to, because I'm 9 years old, for example. So like I used to get my brain into this infinite feedback loop where I would think, well, so God knows all my thoughts. Well, what if I swear at God? And then I would swear at God in my mind. And then I'd be like, no, 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 no. I can't do that. I'm really sorry. Well, what if I can't avoid it? And then I'd do it again. And it'd be like this weird
Mm-hmm.
cycle of constantly thinking that I was on the verge of doing something that would send me to hell as even a 9-year-old. And so it was either one of those things where I myself would just start to become like racked with guilt for what are fairly innocuous child behaviors, or I just didn't buy it. Part of me just went, well, hey, wait a minute. If this Jesus fella is so friendly and nice and his father in heaven is so forgiving, then why is it so easy for me to go to hell? And so I never enjoyed it. It was just a very like either boring and tedious or mentally torturous experience for the most part.
Gotcha. Gotcha. You know, that's been that's been one of the knocks I think on organized religion for quite some time, right? Like I think I think guilt can be healthy, right? If you do something and the spirit convicts you, and it causes change, I think that's healthy. Shame, on the other hand, I tend to look at, and that's I think used more from the pulpit than maybe we would like to admit, right? Within organized religion. And I look at things like constant shame, or that feeling of being on the verge of going to hell. And especially as a young kid, I mean, I can't imagine why people keep signing back up for that type of thought, right? I mean, that's rough stuff. What was it about the new atheism that appealed to you?
Um, well, so let me answer that question, but first, let me go back to the guilt point that you made, because I would just like to add one extra thing. So
Sure.
I think the other problem, and this is kind of one of the beauties of Mormon doctrine, and we can get into this too, is that there was not much in the way of proportionality in the Catholic Church. So, like, when you go to confession, they give you what you call penance, which is like you're
Hmm.
going to say a certain number of prayers or do a certain number of good things, and then you will have your forgiveness, which is kind of a weird concept anyway, that the priest might know what God wants from you in order to be forgiven. But let's assume that it is true just for the sake of this argument. There's not a lot of proportionality beyond that. So the penance would be much worse if the sin that you committed was really, really terrible. But the basic premise was most of the sins you were committing were actually mortal sins. And that's why you're going to confession, is because you don't want to go to hell. And so I think the other problem with guilt, I agree with you, it's healthy, especially if it affects change. But the other problem with guilt is that it must necessarily be proportional, or else it'll be ineffective. It's either
Sure.
going to paralyze you or it's going to make you not care. I mean, you can imagine a child, right? So, when you have a kid, your kid does something dumb. You might be like, hey, go stand in timeout for 5 minutes. If your kid does something mean spirited and crappy, and it's the fifth time they've done it, now you might send them to their room for a couple hours. And eventually, if they keep doing it, then you might ground them for a week, right? Like there's proportionality to the consequence that your child receives. But
Mhm.
in and like I said, I don't know if this is in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, like the book of official doctrine, or if this is just a feature of Catholic culture. But the way that I understood it was basically every sin I was committing was a mortal sin. And so you need to go to confession, because the only way to be sure that you're not going to go to hell for all of the otherwise fairly innocuous things that you do is to tell a priest. And to me, that makes you either jaded or paralyzed,
Mhm.
especially when you're a kid. And so that would be my comment about guilt. As to what was appealing about new atheism, well, I was a teenager and it was contrarian, and that was one thing. I've got a real problem with authority, and that's just something that always, I used to think I struggled with. Now I actually think it's a blessing, but I've got a real problem with authority. Like, if you're going to tell me what to do, then I'm going to give you the middle finger.
Mhm.
If I don't think that it's in my best interest, or in the best interest of whatever that thing I'm working on behalf of is. At the time, it was obviously not God's cause. And so, my understanding of my relationship with God was one of petty authoritarianism because of the Catholic Church, petty, disproportionate authoritarianism. And that doesn't jive well with my personality. And
Got
so it was contrarian. And also, it was a way for me to reject what I thought was sort of like the archetypical authoritarian model. The third thing is that, my personality type is, if you did like the Myers-Briggs personality test, which is totally creepy, by the way. If anybody's listening to this and you haven't done the Myers-Briggs test, go do it, and it's going to know you better than you know you, which is totally weird. But my Myers-Briggs personality type. So basically, what happens for anybody that doesn't know this is there's four letters that you are assigned, and each letter stands for something. So the first letter is like I or E, and it stands for introverted and extroverted. And then the next letter is N or S, and it stands for intuitive, or I can't remember, like analyzing or something. And then it's an F or a T, which is feeling or thinking, and then it's a J or a P, which is perceiving or judging. And if you read my Myers-Briggs personality score, it's like ruthlessly logical, like just uncompromisingly logical. And I don't care if you don't like it. If it's right, it's right. If it makes sense, it makes sense. And tough. You can deal with it if it offends you. And that's been the way that I've been forever. And so at a really cursory level, and this was sort of my own ignorance at the time, it just seemed like the most logical thing, because here I am, at the time a teenager, at least by this point, being told by all of these people around me that we have to go to church and tell this guy who himself is probably a sinner about all the things we did wrong, and then he's going to tell us what God wants, and somehow he's the only one that knows what God wants, and the whole thing just seemed illogical and authoritarian. And so when I found this thing that was contrarian, it was anti-authoritarian, and it seemed to be deeply logical, I just went, that's it. That's the right thing. And so that's what got me to attach to that way of thinking.
Do you think you ever had 100% complete buy-in on it, or do you think it was more of a fascination with the line of thinking?
No, I mean, I think I was pretty well bought in. I mean, at one point, but see, so that's a weird question, because when you say, do you think you were bought in? The question is like, what does it mean to be bought in? So I would have said to you in the most passionate, heavy, heated argument that the end is the end. But at the same time, I never became such a nihilist that I was, I don't know, willing to kill you over the necklace that you had. And so I guess, like, on the surface, I was totally bought in, but I never behaved like there wasn't a God. Like, I still adhered to principles of right and wrong in my everyday behavior. And so I guess maybe subconsciously I never was. That's a good point.
I've always said, I think this is a lot along the same lines of when someone tells me they're a pacifist. I say, to what end? Are you
Yeah.
willing to watch your kids get demolished? Are
Yeah.
you still a pacifist? I
Yeah.
mean, at what end? I'm not sure. I'm sure there are, but I don't think there's a lot of 100% pure pacifists. I just don't think it exists. And what with a lot of the atheists I've spoken to, sometimes I get the feeling like they're trying to buck authority, which I totally understand. I can relate to you 100% on bucking authority. I feel that way too, and I get that. Um, but at the same time, there's certain things that I'll hear from time to time that make me go, "Are you really though? I mean, are you really bought in to this?" And so I was just curious.
So one of the things that I've come to realize as I've gotten older about people that adopt an atheist, what do you call that? A cosmology? Is that the word? I'm not very
I
eloquent.
I think just a belief, because I mean,
Okay.
in cosmology, there's some sort of theological idea behind it, right?
Okay. So let's just say you adopt an atheist worldview or an atheistic moral framework. I've noticed a couple things about people that do that. First of all, invariably, inevitably, they will find something that becomes their God.
Mhm.
And most commonly in the last 5 years, that God is the state. And generally that God is the state, and it is the cultural causes of the state. And so most of the people that used to be the contrarian atheists during, for example, the COVID times, were fully bought in on all of the most authoritarian things that all of these COVID morons were trying to push on the everyman. And so that's one thing. But then the second thing that I've also noticed about these people that are ostensibly atheists is, generally speaking, that they still have a fairly normal sense of what is right and what is wrong. And what's funny is a lot of them will, a lot of them, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the right words. A lot of them will frame it as though, like, they don't pass judgment on people for their decisions that are different, right? They'll say, like, if you want to, I don't know, you want to lead a hedonistic lifestyle, it's not up to me to decide if that's right and wrong. But generally, they themselves are not actually the ones doing that. Like, have you ever met a real hedonist? They're generally just like either total sociopaths, or they're racked with guilt for their behavior and they believe in God and they just can't seem to get themselves any better. But the people that espouse what I would call a thoughtful atheist worldview generally live like they still have a moral framework that came from somewhere, which they can't explain because there is no God. And so
Right.
that's something that's always confused me is if you don't have God, you replace God with something else, and generally it's the state. And in any case, those people always live as though there is a moral framework anyway, despite their claim that there is no God.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think whether man likes to admit it or not, I do believe that there's a God-shaped part of us, right? That can only
Yeah.
be filled by the belief in something bigger, right? Because I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think men are religious by nature. I think I think probably from the very first time we started looking up into the heavens, we felt a desire to commune with something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, if that gets taken away through like religion or spirituality or those things, something has to fill the void, right? And we know that nature abhors a vacuum. And so you will either start going more left towards a big state, which was really kind of right up Marx's alley, right?
Yep. Yep.
Because he
Marx,
talked
Lenin,
about a
Trotsky, all of them.
yeah, a God state, so to speak, right?
Yep.
Or you end up trying to fill that with booze or whatever your vice is to fill that hole, and it usually ends up leading to some sort of self-destruction. The guys that tend to fare the best are the ones who like the big state, right? Because they have replaced that. But you see it get replaced a lot with other leftist causes as well, right? I mean,
Mhm.
they'll bounce from leftist doctrine to leftist doctrine, and I'm of the opinion that man's religious by nature. He just doesn't want to admit it.
So one of the things that I've really tried to like learn how to do, and I think my background gives me the ability to do this, is to sort of prove out common sense, to present an argument to someone in a common sense way that would speak to a non-believer. And so
Mhm.
to prove your point, right? Let's look all the way back in the records of prehistoric man, right?
Right.
What we know. And we could say a lot of things about how absolutely corrupt and delusional and authoritarian the field of archaeology is and the institutions that govern the field of archaeology. But if we assume, if we take at face value that the discoveries that they've made about prehistoric man are in some way generally accurate, we've got records going back 100,000 years of people basically hunting, reproducing, and performing rituals.
Yep.
Like that is as old as time. And if that doesn't speak to a God-shaped piece, to use your term, of the human experience, I don't know what would.
Right. Yeah, no, it seems to be hardwired in us, right? I mean, there's no way around
Yes.
it. Okay, so back to your story. So you pick up atheism, you tell your mom. I'm sure she was super excited to hear about that.
Yeah. So
Um,
excited.
what happens next?
So, um, kind of nothing in terms of religious development, but at the time at least, but in hindsight, everything in terms of religious development. So what I did then is at this point, so I actually, um, so I don't, I hardly ever share this, but I mean, I guess it's relevant. So we'll go ahead and,
Hey,
so
it's
I
just
started
me
high
and
school.
10,000 of my closest friends. You're good.
Yeah. So I started high school when I was 11 years old. And I actually went to 5 years of high school just because when I was supposed to graduate, I didn't have my driver's license. But at that point, my mom was like, oh, I don't want you, like living at a dorm because I know what you're going to get into. So I need you to drive to school, to college. But you're 15, so you can't drive. So you're going to go to an extra year of high school, which you can walk to, so that when you're graduated, you'll be 16 and then you can drive to college and you don't have to live there. And so at 16, I started driving to college, and school has always come really easy for me. Okay. I just have never really cared much about school, and I've still done reasonably well, like A's and B's most of the time. And so in college, I went to college in a town called Aurora. Okay. So I lived right outside of Aurora, kind of on the outskirts. And I went to college in this town called Aurora. And Aurora nowadays has gentrified and become very nice. And there's fancy restaurants. I went back and I couldn't even believe how nice it was. But back in the day, that was the hood. And I had a very ghetto group of friends that we spent a lot of time doing a lot of stuff I wouldn't repeat on a podcast. And so I was actually governed by principles. I thought, hey, if I enjoy it and nothing like, immediately bad occurs to me as a result, then it's acceptable because
Sure.
God's not real. So that's fine. And so, you know, I, I had guys, I mean, we were the life of the party. We'd go to these ghetto house parties and show up, and all the girls would be wanting to hang out with us, and all the guys would be wanting to, either start fights or be cool and get slaps in and all that stuff. And hey, how's it going? How you been? It's good to see you. Like all that type of thing. We used to record music. Like we'd go to the recording studio. We'd be drinking and smoking constantly. It was just ghetto, man. It was just real ghetto. And that went on for like 6 years or so. And then when I was about 22, it all happened at one time, but it was like the chickens started coming home to roost. So I had one friend who I wouldn't even really call him a friend. I would call him an acquaintance. He was kind of he was in the circles that I ran in.
Sure.
He went to federal prison for, I think it was like 8 months. And if you go to federal prison for 8 months, it means you told on someone to get out. And when he got out, I don't know all the details that happened because nobody wanted to associate with him, but he wound up, I heard later, he wound up dead in a very short period of time. It was like, a few months after he had gotten out. There was another guy that I was close friends with who caught a charge that it was either 25 to life or 20 to life that he was facing, and he was one of my very best friends. And there was another guy who got involved in a violent altercation at a house party who allegedly got involved at a violent altercation at a house party. I mean, I wasn't there, but one of his friends who was also part of our group started wearing a wire around everybody. And we found out about it later. Yeah. And then the last thing is I had a buddy who he ran like a trap house in Aurora, and he didn't own it. His buddy owned the house. And so his buddy was kind of like like the local nice guy, and it was sort of the front for being able to do the business there
Right.
unaffected. Well, the local nice guy got robbed by some guys that figured out what was going on at the house, and they beat him up with shovels and all kinds. I mean, it was really
Ooh.
bad. And all this stuff happened in like a year. And I'm starting to think like, dude, like, have you ever seen the movie Boys in the Hood?
Dude, it's been years, but yes, I did. It was
Okay,
popular.
so in Boys in the Hood, there's like this one guy that's always rolling with all the dudes that are causing all the trouble, but he's always pontificating on like Islam and the plight of the black man. He's like
Right.
very enlightened, that guy, but he's never actually doing anything. He's just kind of always there. That was like me. All my buddies used to be like, "Oh, that's Adam," and so I was never really like doing all the dirt, but I was always there. I was always around this stuff. I was always just it's happening right in front of me. And I got to thinking, man, I'm going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like when SWAT comes through that door, they don't care that I was standing there. I'm
Right.
here, and all this stuff that is not legal in this house
Right.
is it's sitting right in front of me, 5 feet away. So what difference is that going to make? So the last straw was I kind of told those four stories out of sequence, but the last straw was when the guy that I mentioned that had the 25 to life charge, because that was like one of my very closest friends. And I had just started seeing this girl at the time. And I said to her, I said, I gotta go. Like, we gotta get out of here. We gotta get out of Chicago. We gotta get out of Illinois, or I am going to wind up just like these guys. And I just had this moment where like it hit me like you gotta go, man. Get out. And so I spent the better part of a year. I got a union job. And at the time I was making like 16 bucks an hour. And in, 2010 or whatever, that was a ton of money for just, just an entry level union job. And because I was the lowest guy in the totem pole, and none of the guys with seniority ever wanted to work OT, I got all the OT I wanted. So for like a year straight, I'm working 60, 70 hours a week, just racking up the OT and just putting all that money in the bank that I could. And by the end of a year, I had like 20 grand in the bank. And me and this girl were still seeing each other. And I'm not even kidding you. We looked at a map and we said, what seems better than Illinois? And we're like, I don't know, Colorado. And she was like, yeah, sure. And so we got in a car with what few belongings we had, 20 grand. And we just drove to Colorado, man. And we found a hotel when we got there. We found an apartment when we got there. I found a job when we got there, just started over. It was like a fresh start. And so that was good because it had gotten me out of all the potential legal trouble that I could have
Sure.
been in Illinois. But I continued in my generally hedonistic ways, you know, like not hedonistic, I guess I would say like nihilistic and self-serving ways. And slowly but surely, life kind of began to fall apart. I never had any money. My cars started to become unreliable. My job was at risk multiple times for different reasons. Sometimes my own doing, sometimes totally not my own doing. It was just different things. Um, I was broke constantly. I was very angry. I never had any inner peace. I had this very troubled relationship with this girl. Um, I was never very happy. It just sort of like slowly. I caught myself drinking a lot. Like I didn't even realize I'd been doing it, and I'm like,
Right.
man, I am drinking a lot, you know. And so slowly but surely, it starts to get worse and worse and worse, and then finally, this is going to sound really petty, but we got like a 3 foot snowstorm. And I was like, oh, I'm out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. So we up and moved again. And this time we went to Arizona. And when we went to Arizona, that was kind of the last straw. This girl that I had been seeing, she went even further off the deep end than I did. She was
Mm.
drinking way more, doing way crazier stuff. And I just said, this is over. I'm done. This isn't working. And I got out of this relationship. And that was kind of like the lowest point. So if you could graph like the joy in my life from childhood to this point I just described, this is the bottom of the parabola. This is where it hits the lowest point. Then um right at that time I met my wife, and that's what began the conversion experience.
Okay. So I'm big on I tend to call them inflection points, right? It's a point at which you change course.
Yep.
Now, would you say yours was a moment, or was yours like gradual that you recognized it?
It was both.
Okay.
It was both. And that sounds like a wishy-washy answer, but it's
No.
not, and I'll describe it exactly. So what happened was is it was gradual. I was gradually trending towards that inflection point in terms of my downwardly proportionate level of joy. Then a moment happened, and that's when it hit me what had been occurring this whole time. So in hindsight, I had been getting there gradually, but I realized it in a moment. Like there was this moment where, so what had happened was is this girl, and God bless her. I don't know what she's doing in her life now. I hope she's recovered from all of this. I wish nothing but the best for her. But this is just sort of the best way to explain the story. So she used to have what I thought were these like mental episodes. Okay. She had mental illness in her family. Her mom had suffered from bipolar disorder, depression. Her grandmother had suffered from schizophrenia. There was a long history of mental illness. And she used to have what I would call these mental episodes. And basically, it would be like you left for the store and then you came home and suddenly there was a different person that was there. And this person was like unmotivated and sad and had a different sense of humor and spoke differently and even had a different tone of voice. Like that was always the strangest thing, is I could tell from the tone of voice, you know, sort of which version I was going to get. And I had thought these were like these I thought these were episodes. And what was so weird is the behavior was very like almost under the influence, but not. You could
Mm-hmm.
you would look at this girl during this period of time and be like, there's something wrong with you. Well, she calls me one day and she says, hey, I'm in jail. And I'm like, what happened? She says, well, I got pulled over and I was having one of those episodes, and the officer thought that I was drinking, but I wasn't.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, did you take a breathalyzer? She said, no, I didn't take a breathalyzer because I didn't do anything wrong. And so I'm not giving in to those people on principle. And in hindsight, I think that was manipulative because I think that she knew that would appeal to like my anti-authoritarian
Sure.
tendencies. And I was like, good for you. And turns out that it ended up being this really crazy interaction. The police report was wild. She was, you know, swearing at him and kicking and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And they held her down and took her blood and gave her a blood test. And so the whole time she's telling me like, you know, it was just, I just had this episode. I just had this episode. I just had this episode. Well, one day the blood results came back and she was like 4 or 5 times the legal limit. It was like an insane
Wow.
amount of alcohol. Like I would have thought she would be dead. And it was also at like 1 in the afternoon on a Friday or a Saturday. So that made me go, wait a minute. What I thought was a slow descent into mental illness that, sort of together we were lamenting was actually just secret drinking. And you were letting me think it was a mental illness the whole time.
Right.
And so that was my moment. That was when I was like, this ain't it. And so then I was gone. I mean, it took me a day, I think, to be like, nope, I'm out of here.
Yeah, no, I can kind of remember where mine was, right? When that moment where I knew things had to change, I couldn't keep going like I was. And I could tell you the color of the walls, right? What color the walls were, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it was that big of an inflection point. So I was just curious to get yours. So it
Yep.
sounds like it was definitely that. So you pack up, you move to Arizona by yourself,
Yep.
right? You're
Yep.
just like game over. Don't want snow anymore. You
Yep.
were like, I'm going somewhere warm. I'm out of here. So you head to Arizona. How do you meet your wife?
So we were working together and we were just friendly at work. So this is one thing that actually gets me in trouble in the fundamentalist world a little bit is like I kind of know like I know no stranger, and you could be a 20-year-old woman or a 90-year-old man, and I don't really care. Like if you've got something interesting or you're friendly or you present some other unique characteristic that I'm not going to get in an interaction from someone else, then we're going to talk. And you can tell
Sure.
I'm chatty. I've already filled up an hour of time or something just talking. And so I'm always real friendly with everybody. And unfortunately, in the fundamentalist world, young women tend to interpret that as being flirtatious or interested. And it almost never is. Actually, I don't think it ever has been, at least to this point. But that's the way that I am. And so this was just this girl that I knew at work, and I was very friendly with her. And of course, I thought that she was, physically attractive, but um, I had thought that she had a boyfriend and she thought that I had a girlfriend. And neither of us were religious or anything like that. There's no courtship process. And so I just never broached the subject. Well, one day I was just kind of in a funk. I was in sort of I don't know, just like a down mood. And she says to me, she comes and says, "Hey, can I sit by you at lunch?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's fine." So she sits down at the table and we're chatting. And she says, "So what's going on? Like, you seem like you're kind of in a funk." I'm like, "Yeah, like broke up with my girlfriend. Here's the story. Here's what happened." And she tells me this story that like the inverse, she basically did the exact same thing with the guy she'd been seeing.
Mm.
And it was for similar circumstances. I mean, it was crazy how much the two stories aligned. And the more we talked, the more that we found out it was even on the exact same day.
Oh,
And it was
wow.
like, whoa, this is weird. And so I said to her, I said, do you want to go get coffee after work? And she was like, yeah, sure. And that was kind of like the beginning of, what in the Mormon world you would call the courtship process, but when we started seeing each other. And that was sort of that was the first sign that to me that resonated in a way that landed with me that there's a plan and I'm a participant in it.
So just by meeting your wife, it starts to put maybe some cracks in the idea of atheism.
Yeah, correct.
That's that's funny because I can kind of resonate with that. I wasn't an atheist. I did believe there was a God, although I believed he was more of a deist kind of God, right? Just a clockmaker. He just winds things up and then is disinterested after that.
Yep, yep,
And I remember when I met my wife Amber that everything changed because she had a certain light to her that I didn't have. And I was like, whatever she's got, I want some of that.
yep,
Right.
yep.
Now, I didn't realize it was the whole Mormon thing, but I was like, well, I think I can hang. Once I found out she was Mormon, I was like, I think I can hang around her, and that's enough, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
I I don't want to be a Mormon. Those guys are
yeah,
weird, right?
yeah.
So I can identify with that. So what happens next?
So we start seeing each other, and it would be kind of difficult now because there were so many of them, and so many of them were so subtle, but there was just a series of undeniable almost unbelievable coincidences that would occur one right after the other, after the other, after the other. And at this point, we're not like seeing each other. We just kind of have begun to talk, but just the number of coincidences. And she had 2 children from that relationship that she'd been in before. And so they were kind of co-parenting for a few months. And then that guy up and leaves. He just says, hey, we were living in Arizona. He tells her one day, he says, hey, I'm moving to Utah in 3 days. And it's like, 9 hours north, and they're co-parenting. And she's like, so what am I going to do? And I don't know, put him in daycare. And so sort of spontaneously in the middle of what feels like this very organic development of relationship, these 2 kids lose their dad, and they're both very young. I mean, one of them, so I adopted both of them. The younger of the 2, she's 9. She actually has no idea about this backstory at all. I'll tell her one day when she understands like how babies are made and what a marriage is and all that kind of stuff. But at the moment, I don't think that
Sure.
it would generate more questions than answers, and so she doesn't even know. I mean, it's that long ago. But so so he takes off, and I'm like, well, I mean, these kids need a dad, and I'm interested in their mother, and so I guess this is a package deal. And so at this point, it was kind of like a moment where now you either got to find a way to give these kids what they need and basically provide for this woman, or you need to leave. Like, you've got 2 options. This is your fork in the road. And it just seemed like the right thing to do to jump in on the dad train. So what I started doing is I started looking for jobs that would pay enough money that she could quit work. Because at the time we're both working together.
Mm-hmm.
And we started really seeing each other. It became very serious very quickly. And then right before I did find a job, I walked up to her. This was my this is how romantic I am. All the ladies out there are gonna be like, oh, this guy, man, this is good. We were working, and she was in a warehouse, and so she's working at a box packing station. And I after, like I said, after this series of just undeniable coincidences, quote unquote, one after another, I start realizing, like, it's almost like the universe is screaming at me, like, you have to be with this woman, because if you don't, like, you are swimming against the current, and it is a strong current, and you can't swim very good in this grand space that we're all trying to navigate. And so you better figure it out real quick. And so one day I got the inspiration. I was like, you know what? I should marry her. And so I walked downstairs because I was on a mezzanine where my desk was. And I walked down to her pack station, and I said, her name's Shannon. I said, hey, Shannon. She says, hey, what's up? And I said, I think we should get married. And she kind of looks at me, and she thinks for a second, and she goes, okay. And then that was that.
Nice.
We ended up getting married very shortly after that. So right after that was when I found a job that paid enough that she could quit work. And we all moved to Kentucky so we were living in Arizona. We all moved to Kentucky for that job. And kids come with, we get married, and now we are a family. And this is where the sort of like this is where the real conversion experience began to occur. This is where like the meat and potatoes happened, is what I would say.
Well, then let me stop you there, because there's a couple things I want to talk about here. First, good on you. So my old man passed when I was like 13, and I think he knew about a year beforehand he was about to pass, because he started taking me with him even when I was supposed to be in school on long trips, right? For work. He was a diesel mechanic, and he had shops.
Okay, yeah.
In Western Idaho, and a shop in Central Oregon. And so we would bounce between the two. And I remember once he told me something, and again, I'm only 13, and this was not uncommon for that last year when I was in the truck with him a lot. But he would tell me about certain scenarios. This is how you become a man. This is what you do. And one of the things he said to me is if you are ever with a woman who already has kids, the best way you can show you love that woman is by loving her kids. So good on you. But what I want to get to is, what causes you to do that, right? To take all that responsibility? Because if you're looking at it from a happy nihilist point of view, that's kind of the last thing you want, right? Because you're like, I that's a lot of responsibility just to take on. Where does that come from? Is it just because you love the mom, or is there something else at play here, Adam?
That goes all the way back to that question of buy-in,
Okay.
right? Because like I always had this moral compass that I just wasn't really able to ignore. And as a Mormon, I would call that the Holy Spirit or the light of Christ. But at the time, I didn't have a name for it. And I just went, look, like if I pay attention to all of these obvious signs that I am being given by, at the time I would have called it the universe, then that tells me that there's something I am supposed to do. There is a plan here. I am a participant in the plan, and there is a right course of action and a wrong course of action. And it was apparent by like the circumstances that kept occurring in my life. And it felt like the right thing to do. And you could call that inspiration. You could call that the Holy Spirit. You call that the light of Christ. You call it whatever you want. But what it was is it was the right thing to do. And I knew it was the right thing to do. And, you say good on you. But I mean, to me, it wasn't even really like, it was never like, oh, I should make this decision to do this because that would be a good thing. It wasn't even like that. It was almost kind of like this. Imagine a high pressure, intense scenario. Like there's a, bus coming, to use a cliche, and your kid is standing in the way. And because of the way your position, and I don't know how you're stepping or leaning or your shoes or whatever, you can push the kid out of the way, but you're going to get smacked, right? Like
Right.
you don't sit there and go, should I do this? Is this the right thing? Like it's so instinctive. It's so obvious. It's so
Okay.
central to who you are that it's not even really a thought. You just do it. And so I don't think I ever thought like, oh, is this a good idea? It was just like, this is the right thing. This is what you do. And
Okay.
so do it. And so it was never like I felt like I had a choice that I could make differently. So I don't even, I claim absolutely no credit for that decision whatsoever. It was just the right thing. And if I didn't do it, I would have been doing the wrong thing. And nobody wants to do the wrong thing, even if they've got a
Right.
corrupt version of what the wrong thing is. Nobody wants to do what they actually think is the wrong thing. And so it
Right.
felt like I had no choice. This is what you got to do. So get it done, you know?
Wow. And this is interesting too, because I can draw some parallels here. One of the things I find interesting is that when Abraham um sends out the servant, I believe it's Abraham, to find a wife for Isaac, you get the feeling from reading scripture that Isaac is just kind of floating, right? Like he's not a bad guy. He
Mhm.
just isn't self-actualized yet,
Yep.
right? And it's not until his wife comes that he's like, oh crap, I gotta like be a man now, right? I
Yep.
gotta I gotta
Yep.
do stuff. And it's funny how that works for us dudes, right?
Mhm.
I've always said, and I kind of agree with Brigham on this a little bit. A bachelor over in his day it was 18. He'd say a bachelor over this age is a menace to society.
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to that, right? Because as a dude, once you get married and you have responsibilities, not only is it just providing for your family, but there's a switch that flips where you're like,
Yep.
okay, now we got to build stuff, right? Now we
Mhm.
gotta build stuff. It's not enough
Yep.
just to get by. We got to build something, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so there is something about that seems essential to our nature as
Yep.
dudes, right?
Yep.
Get married, have kids, build stuff. That's
Yep.
what we do. And
Yep.
so I found that interesting. I found that tie. So you say once you move to Kentucky, you find a job that's going to take care of you, your wife, she can stay home, raise the kids, you can go to
Yep.
work. What was it in your makeup that also you were like, because let's face it, the trend today is like two income households, right?
Yeah. Yep.
What was it inside of you that said, nah, she should probably, if she, if this is a choice that she wants, she should probably stay home with the kids? What was it about that?
Well, so
Because it's
I mean,
fascinating, right? They're kind of conservative principles, but you're
yeah.
not necessarily a conservative guy, right?
No, yeah, yeah. So what I would say is it's just kind of logical. Just think about it for a second. So, The younger one was, so the older one was in public school. We ended up pulling her out that year and homeschooling her, but we were still learning our way through this, right? So this was just the beginning. But at the time, the younger one was not in school. And I just kind of thought about it for a second. Like, we could send her to daycare and we could pay someone that I don't know, whose values I don't understand, whose priorities and discipline model I'm not familiar with, and I probably don't like, to raise my kid on my behalf so that my wife could make what, about as much as we spend on daycare, or she could raise them herself according to the things that we think are right. And I don't have to pay anybody to do that. And at the same time, she gets the flexibility and freedom to, in the way that you mentioned that the switch flips for a guy. I think the switch flips for a woman when they've got to use a liberal term, the space to like be feminine. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? Like
Yeah.
they've got the latitude to go be a woman. And so I think that probably because the switch flipped for me, intuitively I just knew the switch would flip for her, and so this is the right thing. Here you go. And I don't want some person with some weird, I don't know, some like strange blue hair public school liberal raising my kid for $12 an hour. Like, I don't want that. I want one of, my family members to raise the kid.
Okay. Now, before we go any further, for everyone that's just listening, because I agree with you, by the way, but I just need to tell everyone kind of what you look like, if that's okay.
Yeah,
Right.
go for it. Yeah, that's fine.
Because like Adam doesn't look like a guy who should say things like, I don't want a liberal blue hair raising my kid. Right. But he's correct. Right. But Adam's a guy who's got a little bit of mohawk going on, got some gauges. I mean, does not look like a guy you'd expect that from. But I think you're right too. I think right there, I think that's another thing, right? Dude, so much of society, I just feel like we're forcing a round peg into a square hole,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we can't figure out why nothing's working. And we're like,
Mm-hmm.
why is everything upside down? Well,
Yep.
dudes, I hate to break it to you, but we have, and again, even like, I think you could make this argument even if you were an atheist, right? You could approach it from an evolutionary term, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But from a spiritual side, it just, we've been denying who we are for so long
Yep.
now
Yep.
that we're almost in a state of spiritual amnesia now.
See, and
And
what's funny is I actually think that whole like concept of the evolutionary argument is totally a valid line of reasoning about the things that we should be doing, and I think that is actually atheistic spirituality. I
yeah,
think the evolutionary argument is spirituality for atheists. It's like, what is my basic intuition about the things that I
right,
should be doing, and how can I reason through them? And if I use evolution as my argument, like, oh, we've been performing rituals for a bazillion years, like, I can infer things about the nature of my existence that doesn't necessarily require me to believe in God. If I want a full understanding, if I want the true satisfaction of having, I shouldn't say the full understanding, because of course we're all still working to get there, but if I want a real deep understanding and a strong grounding of principles, I think you have to be religious. In fact, I think you have to specifically be a Mormon, but we can get there. But I think that if you just wanted to be a decent person and infer answers to questions about what you should be doing, I think you can sort of examine the nature of the human condition in a very atheistic kind of a way and probably still get fairly close. I think that actually the inherent ways that we behave are inherent for a reason. And one of those is you don't let someone you don't know raise your kids.
right, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Ooh, good stuff, man. Okay, so
Oh,
yeah, and dude, I could, yeah, it's got to throw people for a loop, which I did. Because here's the thing, I wasn't raised spotless. When Amber met me, I had hair down in the middle of my back. Both my ears were pierced. I, had a couple tattoos.
you
Right.
played guitar in Dragon Force?
Almost. I was more of a Guns N' Roses guy, maybe Manowar. Um, but yeah. So this was, I'm a little bit older than you. Um, like old enough that all I can't wait for my AARP card so I can get all those killer discounts. But
Sweet. Yeah.
anyway, yeah. Anyway, um, okay, so back to the story. So you get married,
Yep.
It's like instant family, just add Adam, right? Shake and
Yep.
stir.
Yep.
You're off and running. So you get to Kentucky. What happens next?
Okay, so first of all, Instant Family is actually a movie that my oldest daughter loves, by the way, and it's
Really?
about basically this same concept. Yeah, and that's why she loves it. So if you ever get the chance, you should watch the movie. But so anyway, so what happens when we get there is, now I've landed in Kentucky with this sense that like there's a plan. And there's a right way for me to proceed through the universe, and there's a wrong way for me to proceed through the universe. And that begs the question: if there's a plan, who's the planner? And can I decipher the rest of the plan correctly? Like, how do I decipher the plan? Like, what's the skill there? Right?
So
You know what
you're
I mean?
not
Let's say, for example,
you're
go ahead.
not quite a God guy yet, right?
No, not yet, not yet.
Okay.
So, like, let's say, for example, I work in the corporate world, okay? And let's say you're working on a project. You're going to have a project plan, and that project plan is going to have timelines and milestones and Gantt charts and resources and all this stuff. And if you've never seen a corporate project plan ever, like if your whole life has been spent framing houses and you look at a corporate project plan, it's probably going to be fairly meaningless. Like there's a skill to being able to decipher a highly detailed plan. And so I kind of thought about it that way, like what's the plan, right? Like what am I supposed to be doing, and how do I know what I'm supposed to be doing? How do I go figure that out? But I didn't have any answers for it yet. Then I had this inspiration that my wife and I should land on or agree on some values. Like, what are our family values, right? Because how can we hold each other? This was my thought. How can we hold each other to account? How do we know how we're raising our children if we can't specifically articulate those values that are important to us? And at the time, I was thinking about it in terms of behavioral characteristics. And I still think these are the proper behavioral characteristics. But my wife and I spent probably years going, like, probably months working on the initial list and then years making small tweaks here and there. And what we landed on was that and this is actually on our wall. It's on like a letter board. You know, those like letter boards you like stick a letter on, and then you get this black and it's got the white letters and they got little pegs in the back and they
Yeah.
stay in the board. So this letter board says a good person is ... and then it's got a list: honest, respectful, kind, confident, hardworking, independent, inquisitive, modest, trustworthy, grateful, adventurous, and positive. And to me, those are the things that constitute a good person in terms of behavioral traits. Okay.
Sure.
I don't think you can be a good person. I don't think you can be a really good person if you're missing one of those. And we spent a long time trying to land on what that was. And so now this sits on our wall, and every time the kids do something wrong, I shouldn't say every time, but every time they exhibit a behavioral trait that is in conflict with one of these, we will walk them over to the board and we will say, look, which one of those did you screw up? And then we will make them explain how they could have done it better. And so we land on this list of values, and I start to realize that the more that we follow these values, the better our lives get, like in every
Mhm.
way. And it's not just the values. It's also, we became engaged, or I became, remember the switch that flips?
Yep.
I became engaged in like more wholesome and productive passions. You know, I started like literally building things, to use your expression, building things. I got into plants. I got into books and reading. I got into, like just spending time with my kids. I'd always been into fitness, but that just got way more hardcore. And so now I've got all of these really productive passions, and almost all of my time is spoken for in some kind of value added way. And as this is how I'm living, and I've got this backbone of values, more and more blessings start coming into our family. So the satisfaction of the job that I was doing, the money that I was making, like my sense of right and wrong, it became so much clearer. Our family grew. We started having more children. The stability of our family increased. The closeness of our family, the way that other people related to our family, our sense of fulfillment, like our sense of, we were fulfilling this purpose that like we had from before we knew we had it. My wife with the children, and myself with going out and like making stuff happen. And the more that we lived according to these values, and the more that I was engaged in those productive passions, and the more that I tried to lead a righteous life, the more blessings that we received. And
Mm.
things just kept getting better and better and better the more that I tried to do those things. And so then I went, okay, at this point, I can't deny this anymore. Like, there's clearly, this is, my aunt calls it juju. This is some good juju coming back to me for doing good stuff. So now I need to understand what that is, right? And that's where I started getting into the scriptures. So up until this point, it was kind of like I've got this sense, and over time, the sense just became obvious. It wasn't even a sense anymore. It was like, you're a blind idiot if you don't see this. And I didn't want to be a blind idiot. And so now it became, all right, well, there's been a lot of people throughout many thousands of years of human history that have made their best attempt to explain this to us. And so what did they have to say? And so that's when I started reading scripture.
Did your wife start down that road with you, or was that you at the beginning?
So in spirit, yes. She's not like much of a reader. So generally, like, she gets her information through me, but she absolutely started down that road in terms of her understanding. So like, when I would explain something to her, she would be very engaged and ask meaningful questions and challenge things that she didn't think made sense. And so in terms of like the worldview, yes. In terms of the reading, not so much.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Okay. So, and when you say scriptures, are you looking at different faith traditions? Are you sticking mainly with the Judeo-Christian, scriptures? What
Mostly like
into?
mostly like the Abrahamic stuff. So
Okay.
I read the Bible, I read the Quran. I had read some of the Apocrypha. I even read something called the Kitab-i-Aqdas, which belongs to the Baha'is. I don't want to offend anybody, but that is a weird religion, very like liberal globalist stuff. It feels like the UN created it. I really just looked for inspired books. Like, give me something so that something can click for me, so that I can understand like what it is that I should be doing here.
Okay. All right. Good enough. So you start tearing things apart.
Yep.
What happens next?
So so I didn't realize this at the time. But the problem with religion is the institutions that surround the practice generally. And so I would read something, and then I'd be like, okay, so like the Quran, right? And so I read the Quran, and there's some really good stuff in there. And I still think that's an inspired book. Like, I don't think that, like, I don't. Okay, so let's back up for a second, because I think this is an important way to frame this. So there's probably a lot of Mormon fundamentalist types that would totally disagree with this characterization, but there's probably a lot that would agree. To me, scripture is, to borrow a liberal term, it's kind of a spectrum. And so there are things that are very obviously not inspired, like my fourth grader's writing assignment. Like, most likely, unless she's, if she's talking about like what I did last weekend, it's probably not an inspired work.
Right.
And then there are things that are, to me, definitively inspired, like the Book of Mormon. Like, there is no question in my mind, this fits the definition of scripture. But then I think that throughout the history of world religions, because I don't know what God is doing with other people, or I mean, I don't even know if they, we believe in a plurality of gods. I don't even know if they're answering to the same one. Like, I don't know. Joseph Smith said that a world defines like sort of like the lineage of people in a religious epoch. Maybe they belong to a different world. I don't fully know. I don't know. It's not up to me to decide. But what I do know is the content in these scriptures, in many cases, seems to me to be very inspired. And I wouldn't consider them like canon in my world, like, because the Quran says it doesn't necessarily mean that like it's something I believe. But what I would say is that if there's something I believe and the Quran seems to accept the same basic premise and then elaborate a little further on what that means, it's probably valuable information. And so that's kind of the way that I think about scripture. And so at the time, I would, and I'd read this stuff and I'd go, okay, well, so who's the people that believe this and how do they practice? And I'd always find these like weird habits that or practices that I just wasn't okay with, like that I just couldn't get over in my mind, because intuitively. So you remember that like spirituality for atheists that we talked about, where you can sort of infer something about the human condition just by using common sense. There were things in much of the religious practice surrounding these scriptures that made me go, no, that's not for me. So like an example of this is, one of the most fascinating religious groups, partly because of its independence, but then partly because of some very interesting similarities later I would learn to Mormonism, is Sikhism, which came out of the Punjab in India. And they've got this holy book called the Sri Guru Granth Sahib. And this book contains a whole bunch of totally inspired stuff. Okay. Like, but it's not all the way there. There's parts where I'm like, this is goofy. And one of the things that these people do is they've got this practice. They call it the 5Ks. I don't remember exactly what it all means, but basically they don't cut their hair. They don't cut their beards. The women don't either. The women don't like really groom themselves at all. And they always wear like a knife and a comb. And it's like weird stuff, So like, and I believe most of them are vegetarians. They don't eat meat. And like I listen to this. I meet people that sort of belong to this tradition. I ask questions, and I'm just going, intuitively, this doesn't seem correct. Like there doesn't seem to be, I'm sure that there's like a reason that these rituals exist, and those things probably resonate very deeply to people that belong to that tradition. But very obviously, this kind of thing is not something that resonates with me, and it doesn't make sense to me. And so, though I find inspiration, I'm not going to go join up, right? Like there's just things that make me guys weird. And that was kind of the nature of the way that I interacted with almost all the scriptures. I'd go looking for, well, who's the people that this is fairly inspired? Who's the people that practice it? And then I would just find that there were things that I couldn't get past, like, uh, in certain traditions, like one of the traditions that totally fascinates me in terms of theology, because it's remarkably close to early Gnostic Christian theology, and in many ways, it's very close to, if we had a bigger tradition of theology in Mormonism, and specifically like metaphysics, I think that it would probably be like what you would call Neoplatonism is the foundation of where I'm going. And I think that actually sort of lines up fairly well with the idea that the Father, in the lectures on faith, that the Father and the Son are two personages, and the Holy Ghost is sort of like the universal intellect, right? That concept of the
Right.
universal intellect is something that was first written down in a way that I'm aware of in this 50-volume series of books by these guys that were Ismaili Muslims in the Safavid Empire in the 11th century AD. I believe they were called the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity. And so these guys would get together and they would write these treatises on the metaphysics of who God was, and, like their relationship to God, and things that weren't even related, math and stuff like that. And it's fascinating. It's really good stuff. And I think a lot of that actually lines up reasonably well. And I'm sure that the theologians that are listening to this are probably just cringing because I'm not explaining it very well, but lines up reasonably well, I found out later, with Mormon doctrines around like who is God and who is the Son and what is the
Right.
nature of the Holy Spirit, all these kinds of things. But that group of people has this really, really strong deference to the guy in charge in a way that I just can't stomach. And so like I knew that wasn't right, right? Like, and I mean, I really studied to try and figure out what it was that I believed. And I just, man, I couldn't find nothing. Christianity is a funny one too, like regular, like mainstream Christianity. One of the things that I just couldn't get past, and later fundamentalism made total sense to me for this, is so I am not I have one wife. I'm not married plurally. And that is, I've heard these stories, conversion stories of guys, oh yeah, I became a fundamentalist because I had this revelation that I was gonna live celestial plural marriage. And I have not had that revelation. But the old patriarchs of the Bible were all polygamists.
Right.
And modern Christianity, non-Mormon Christianity, and I guess even the LDS Church, condemn polygamy so hard. I could
Right.
never get over the contradiction of, then what do you do with Abraham?
Mm.
Like that just bothered me. Like I
Right.
never thought that it was wrong. Before becoming a Mormon, I never understood the spiritual value of something like this. Before you understand like the celestial kingdom and the progression to godhood and the fact that we have spirit parents and all these kinds of things. Before you understand all that, plural marriage is not like a moral, like it's not like a moral obligation. It's not a commandment in that context, but I never thought it was like wrong. I just
Right.
like, I didn't think it was a commandment, but I never thought it was wrong. And then I would read the Bible and I'd be like, well, these guys are doing it. Why is this so bad? This doesn't make any sense. And to me, that was such a logical conflict. I could never get past it.
Okay. All right. No, that does make sense, right? It's hard to condemn the religion that you live in if you, or let me rephrase that. It's hard to fully embrace the religion you live in if you're from one of the Abrahamic traditions and then turn around and castigate plural marriage, right?
Yes.
I mean, it just doesn't seem to make sense.
No.
And one of my favorite arguments to the folks who like to deny it is like, well, seemed to work out okay in producing the savior.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, no, I agree with you. There's an obvious conflict there.
Yep. So that was actually the thing that ended up, like, in a very roundabout kind of way, getting me to fundamentalism. So what happened is I wanted to resolve that conflict in my mind very badly, because I knew that I belonged to a Western culture. And I think that culture is extremely powerful in terms of the lens through which you understand your relationship to God. And I also think that when we talk about a culture, we may be talking about the thing that Joseph Smith referred to as a world, you know? And so, like, this, to me, this is extremely powerful. And so I knew that I belonged to a Western culture that was of a Christian tradition. And so I thought that it would make the most sense for me to spend my time trying to resolve some of the conflicts regarding Christianity in my mind. And the plural marriage question was a big one, just because it just felt like such a bizarre oversight that all of the historic Old Testament patriarchs live this way. And yet it's supposed to be one of the most evil sins that you can perform. Like, I can't reconcile these two. So I start trying to. Well, I come across Polygamy in the Bible by Ogden Kraut. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. I should read this. And what he his basic argument is, you know, the condemnations of polygamy are coming from the institutions of religion outside of the Bible. They're not coming from the Bible itself.
Right.
And that was when the light bulb went off for me. I was like, oh, so the religion is actually more the scripture, right? The scripture is kind of where you're grounded, not in the actual institution that surrounds the scripture. And that was the first kind of like light bulb where I went, okay, so you can actually draw a totally different conclusion that sucks and is wrong when we read the same book. And so then that's when I knew that guy was a Mormon. And so then I was like, oh, I should read the Book of Mormon because, you know, I don't know, this guy's pretty reasonable. And so let me read that. And then that's where Mormonism started. So I can stop there. And then if you have any
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. So in some ways, you're already gearing yourself up to be a fundamentalist and you kind of don't know it, right?
Yes, correct.
You already have a problem with draconian rule, right?
Yep.
And that's going to put you at odds with the LDS church, with any structure that's super hierarchical and you have to live by that. So
Yep.
so you know, LDS church is probably out. And then you make a very important distinction that I think it takes a lot of Mormons, especially coming out of the LDS church, to wrap their minds around, right? Which is you put it as scripture over the institution, right?
Yep.
Is that the religion is the scripture, and then you have the institution which is trying to administer this
Yes.
this program. We've had those kind of debates within Mormonisms for years with scripture, with it, and it also further kind of complicates the matter when you start realizing that when someone's moved upon by the Holy Ghost and they're speaking by the Holy Ghost, the DNC tells us that's kind of scripture too, right? Mm-hmm. And so now you have all of these early brethren, they're talking about this, and we have the same thing with priesthood, right? And so in some ways, you've managed to answer the question a lot quicker, probably because you didn't come from a very hierarchical church experience, right? You did have a little bit of time in the Catholic Church, but that didn't leave much of an impression. So you're able to kind of get rid of the junk that some of the institutions bring, and you're able to get grounded right inside the scripture, right inside principle over the philosophies of men.
Yep.
So now when you do this and you pick up the Book of Mormon, what happens then?
So I read the Book of Mormon, and you got to understand, okay? And I'm not really saying this to you because I think you mentioned you had converted, but like, to those in your audience that grew up in the LDS church, the idea that these people, the Nephites and the Lamanites, who you have never heard of in any of your public school education and in any of your archaeology, and the Smithsonian Institution has never mentioned them. Never mind, by the way, that there is a temple in Belize whose pre-Columbian name has been preserved, and it's a point of pride for the local people, and it's called Lamani, the Temple of Lamani. Never mind any of that, right? But
Just a
you never heard,
coincidence. Move on.
just a coincidence, exactly. So you never heard of any of this stuff, and it rewrites your understanding of the North American continent. And so this cognitive dissonance, it was, first of all, I read the book and I go, hey, look, I mean, this is a very impressive book, and it contains a lot of eternal wisdom, and I think it is inspired, kind of like how I thought about most of the other scripture that I had read. But I had a lot of cognitive dissonance over the idea that like this was this thing that we just don't really have much of a record of anymore. I hadn't ever listened to a Wayne May talk at this point.
Sure,
So like
sure,
I didn't
sure.
I didn't realize that was also not right. But at the
Shout out to
time,
Wayne. Yeah.
yeah. And so at the time I was just like, hey, this totally undermines almost everything I thought about the history of where I live. And so it was really hard for me to get past that cognitive dissonance. Then I started finding out a little bit more about the circumstances surrounding the book. So I was totally willing to concede that it was an inspired book. Okay.
Okay.
And then I discover that some of the people that, to me, and this is probably going to be very controversial if anybody that's not a Mormon ever hears this, but that's okay. To me, some of the people that I look at as like modern day folk heroes were moved by Mormonism. So one of the coolest things that I figured out is, do you remember the Bundy Ranch standoff? Do you remember that? Like
Oh
in
yeah.
2014? Yeah. So for anybody that's not listening, here's what happened. Okay. So there's this guy, Cliven Bundy. He's like an old, Nevada rancher, and puts his foot in his mouth a lot. He's not a great talker, but he's a rancher, and so that ain't his job. And so what he does is he's ranching his cows on some BLM land that he's been leasing for a long time. And suddenly the BLM says, hey, you can't graze your cows on that land anymore because there's this tortoise that is endangered or something. And Cliven Bundy, in good old Nevada rancher fashion, says, nah, that's okay. I'm going to keep doing it. And he does. And so they start fining him, and he racks up like millions of dollars in grazing fees. And eventually the BLM gets so pissed off at this guy that they decide that they're going to swoop in with their helicopters and tranquilizers and cattle trailers, and they're just going to take his cows. And so he calls his son Ammon, who I think actually ran for governor of Idaho and got like 20% of the vote, which is awesome.
Yep.
And Ammon calls his buddies, and they all show up at the Bundy Ranch with a bunch of guns and basically said, hey, you know what? You want these cows? You come and take them. And man, to me, that's like the spirit of what it means to be American. Like if there is an organization that is a bigger waste of resources than the BLM, I don't know what it is. Did you know 98% of their budget is spent wrangling up horses because you can't kill them on the plains in Nevada?
Dude,
98% of their budget goes to making sure that horses aren't killed on public lands.
dude, as a land surveyor, I have to deal with them.
Yeah.
Time to time.
Yeah.
I got some horror stories, right?
Yeah,
like
I believe it.
As a surveyor, I remember watching that and I was like, you go get them, son. Right.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
put them in their place because they
Yep.
are a crooked, corrupt organization.
Yep.
The way
And so here's a bunch of guys that stand up for a righteous cause against the Leviathan blob that is the administrative state of the United States, which is so far removed from what the founders would have had it to be. And I found out that, guess what? They painted a little title of liberty on a big old cloth, and they flew it right over the entrance to the Bundy Ranch when that happened. And I went,
Yep.
oh, these guys are motivated by the principles that are contained in this book. That I like those guys. They're doing some of the right stuff. That's pretty interesting. So that was one thing. Another thing that happened is I found out about the writing process. So this is crazy too. For anybody that's never just thought about this for a second. Okay, so let's talk about the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon ostensibly the story goes, the Book of Mormon is discovered by Joseph Smith. It's these golden plates, and then through the power of God, he learns to translate this ancient and dead language, and he dictates the contents of the book to a series of scribes that write it down in his behalf, and eventually it gets compiled and then sort of rewritten into a printer's manuscript, and then it hits the press and it becomes a book. So it's kind of a crazy story. Like if you were I mean, even if you are a Mormon, I think you just have to be like, oh yeah, that's a crazy story,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like that's nuts. And just the idea of even imagining like discovering some golden plates with an ancient religion, or sorry, with an ancient language that contained these sort of deep eternal truths of, an ancient people that were very religious and, faced a lot of struggles. And I mean, the whole thing just for you to just dictate that and figure out how to do it, I mean, it just seems nuts. But then I learned the counterfactual. And so the counterfactual argument is if you just pretend, just for the sake of this argument, Joseph Smith was a deceitful liar and he made all of it up, right? Okay, fine.
Right.
For the sake of this argument, he makes it all up. Well, that means that a half literate country boy from upstate New York with no access to, any real meaningful libraries or other content writes one of the most sophisticated books in the history of the English language on a first draft in 4 working weeks.
Yeah.
Like that sounds even crazier to me. Like I can believe that like the inspired work of God motivates somebody to move mountains sooner than I can believe that some podunk hick managed to figure that one out.
Yeah, dude. I had a college professor. I took a course in Jacksonian America. And you can't really talk about Jacksonian America without talking about the Mormons,
I
right?
believe that. Yep.
And I remember there was a small section, like it was half a class is all we talked about it. But he said something very interesting. He says, as you approach Joseph Smith, you can come up with only one of two conclusions. He was either exactly what he said he was, or he was the most raw genius that certainly America, maybe the world, has ever produced.
Yep. Yep.
Point blank. And then he ran down his resume, right? And
Yep.
and just like you were saying, the Book of Mormon is one of them. The other, how do you get people to follow you like he did without threat of force,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and really share power the way he did, right?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, all those things. I that resonates with me what you said because I've had those same thoughts.
Yep. Yep. So once I learned what the counterfactual argument was, or what it would entail to say that Joseph Smith was just lying and deceitful and full, what, then I went, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Then I came across Hugh Nibley, and
Mm.
that was when I read Lehi in the Desert. And if you ever need to convince a non-Mormon that Joseph Smith was onto something, have them read the first book of Nephi and then have them read Lehi in the Desert,
Yep.
because that makes you go
Right.
like you just
Mind blowing.
mind blown. You can't even believe it. And so I read it, and there's all kinds of stuff in there. Like, for example, Joseph Smith was made fun of profusely by the early, sort of opponents of Mormonism because Alma was a girl's name. And they find out that right around the time that Lehi made his journey, it actually was a guy's name in Judaism. And, and they mentioned that they buried Ishmael at the altar at Nahom, and an altar of uncut stone. And then sure enough, in the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert in 1953, they find an altar of uncut stone with the inscription Nahom on it. Like, I mean, come on, man. Like there's so many of these things. And Hugh Nibley just runs down the list in Lehi in the Desert. And that's when I was like, this is basically when I was there. At this point, I'm like, okay, this is real. Then what I would call the last straw was the Book of Moses, Book of Giants story. So for anybody that's not familiar, I'll just retell this as though nobody understands it, and that way there's no gaps. So, and there might be non-Mormons listening to this, so we'll go ahead and just, I mean, on the off chance that's true, I'm going to explain even what the Book of Moses is. So the Book of Moses is basically Joseph Smith's revisions. They would call it a translation. We would call it a translation in Mormonism, but it's not translation the way you would think about, like, oh, this is Hebrew, I'm going to make it German or something. It's Joseph Smith took the book of Genesis, and then through the inspiration and power of God, removed and added things that made it more correctly in line with what would have been the early contents of the book of Genesis. And one of the things that he did in the book of Moses is he added the Enoch story. And there's this, I mean, added much of the Enoch story. And so there's this whole like story about this guy Enoch and all these things that Enoch is doing and whatever. So he writes the book of Moses, and he is, of course, the recipient of hostile condemnation early on. And, what kind of hubris must you have to go and change the contents of the Bible? You must think you're as good as God himself, all this type of stuff. Okay. Well, Joseph Smith obviously dies in 1844, and nobody is like, he hasn't been vindicated at this point yet to non-believers, right? Well, then in 1947 or 53 or whatever it was, the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered. And one of these scrolls that gets translated is what's called the Book of Giants. And the Book of Giants is, I think actually, if I'm not mistaken, it's the most popular book at the Qumran caves. I think it's the one they found the most copies of. And so the Book of the Giants includes the Enoch story. And Joseph Smith's Enoch story was one nobody had ever. I mean, there was all kinds of Enoch stories from Apocrypha that had existed throughout the years and traditions and stuff, but the stuff he added was really specific kind of stuff that was not like you wouldn't find it in other Enoch stories. Well, so the Book of Giants gets translated by a guy named Matthew Black, and the astute and late great Hugh Nibley just so happens to notice that, oh, these are word for word the exact same. And when I say word for word, I don't literally mean like, precise sentence and grammar, but like you can read each sentence and they're saying the exact same thing in just slightly different ways. But I mean, it's the same thing. It's the exact same story, line by line. Yep. And I learned that and I go, okay, I'm in. And then that was pretty much that, man.
Yep. So I'll tell you what, I just had a guy on here. I haven't released it yet, but we were talking about the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
And even so, like the closest Book of Enoch to Joseph Smith during his time was available in French in France. Yep. Right. Well, we know he's not getting a hold of that. Right. One, he doesn't speak French. He's struggling enough with English at this point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
he writes it. But there were bullseyes even within that, right? Yeah. That essentially, again, you gotta be like either Joseph Smith was a prophet or he was a damn good guesser, right? Yeah, those are the two options you're left with.
I like the bullseye term because the way that I would describe it is either Joseph Smith got this right because he was inspired by the power of the Lord, or that man won the lottery like 5 times a day for his whole life. Like this, like the statistical improbability of this guy getting the number of things correct down to the minutia to include like the philologically correct naming conventions. If you combine Egyptian and Hebrew naming traditions, like all of this kind of stuff that this dude got right, you would have had to be, like I said, it'd be like winning the lottery 5 times a day for your entire life. Like it is just a statistical impossibility that he guessed all this stuff.
Yep, absolutely. Whew. So, okay. So now, okay, first, once you are like, oh man, it's in Mormonism, what was your first thoughts?
I don't know. Just like, this is obviously correct. I mean, I guess about Mormons, the only thing that I noticed is like, I would know Mormons in my life that always seemed to do things well. Like one of the problems of modern culture is we don't really have like a meritorious culture of excellence anymore. Sure. Where like you're judged by your ability to be competent at something. And I think competence is something that our culture is just generally lacking, right? Yep. But I noticed that a lot of Mormon people that I knew were like pretty skilled and pretty competent. And they seemed to be upright people and they had big families and they seemed to generally be financially responsible. And whenever they had pursuits that I was aware of, they always seemed to be competent in those pursuits. And so I think if I thought anything about Mormonism, because I don't think I thought a ton about it, it was, hey, guys like Ammon Bundy are Mormons, and the ones I know are doing pretty good. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's something to this. That would have been about the extent to which I thought about Mormonism specifically.
Okay, that's interesting because I was raised in Western Idaho in my teenage years, right? So we had plenty of exposure to Mormons, right?
Yep.
Played football with Mormons, some of the best designated drivers I ever had, right, growing up. But I did not want any part of that crap, right? I
Yeah, yeah,
understood enough to be like, those dudes are weird, nice guys, but weird, and I want no part of it. Like
yeah,
I
yeah,
argued with God, like I don't want to be a Mormon. I don't
yeah,
think you
yeah,
understand. I get it, but I don't
yeah.
want to do it.
Yep.
So
So real quick, the designated driver joke. Have you ever heard the joke? Why do you always take two Mormons fishing?
that way they don't drink your beer.
Because if you take one, he'll drink all your beer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Yep, yep. There's more truth to that. It only for the LDS guys though. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
I
I
know.
mean, well, so here's another funny story. Sorry, I'm just kind of hijacking your podcast and
No,
telling
you're
funny
good.
stories. But so when I was living in Missouri, so for anybody that's not that isn't familiar with like where I live or my life story, which is probably like 99.99% of anybody that's going to hear this, I lived in Missouri for a while in the same place where a lot of my Mormon brothers and sisters still live. There's an area in Southwest Missouri where there's a lot of people that live, and they're doing some really great work there. And I was living there for a little while. Now I live in Brownsville, Texas. If you don't know where Brownsville is, go look at a map of Texas and it's at the bottom. Okay. But so I was living in Missouri for a little while. And when I was there, I had some missionaries come to the house. Okay. And they're like, hey, and that was crazy. That was really cool because I needed another Book of Mormon because I've got the 1831 printing version that doesn't have versification. And it's great because it's 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 like the way it was supposed to be read. It's not split up by the verses and stuff. But if you need to find a passage, it's really cumbersome. Like, cause you got to like just search and read and search and
Sure.
eventually you'll get there. But I literally said to my wife, I need another Book of Mormon with versification. And maybe 10 minutes later, I hear a knock on the door and it's the two missionaries and they're like, "Hey, have you, I'm so and so from the LDS Church. I'm elder something or other, and I'm elder something or other." And I was like, "Oh, hey, do you have a Book of Mormon that I can have?" And they were like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "Cool, I need one. Why don't you come on in?" And then I explained to them, that we were. I tried not to use the term fundamentalist, and actually, we should talk about that. Let's talk about that, by the way, what I think about the term fundamentalist. But so I tried to explain to them like we're like old school Mormons. Like we don't go to the church. We believe in all the same things you do, and actually probably we believe it more. If you ever have a faith crisis, give me a call because we could probably help you out. And I was explaining to them the type of stuff that we believe in, and it was a very engaging conversation and very pleasant. And they ended up leaving feeling really good, and I felt really good. It was a great time. Like these are my brothers in the restoration, and it's a little bit of a dysfunctional family, but we're all we all
Getting
belong to
along.
the same
Yeah.
household, the way I'm thinking about it. And that's kind of my general view of Mormonism. And so one day I said, uh, I'm leaving Walmart and I've got a 6-pack of beer in my hand. And I walked by these two guys and I said, "Gentlemen, I got a question for you." And they said, "What's up?" And I said, "The word of wisdom says that barley is for the making of mild drinks. What is a mild drink to you?" And I held up the 6-pack of beer. And one of them goes, "I've wondered that myself."
It was postum. That's what it was. They
Yeah,
were
yeah,
going to post them. No.
yeah.
So okay, let's go back to the story here. So you're like, oh, Mormonism's true.
Yep, yep.
Now you gotta go tell your wife. What does she think when you drop that bomb?
Well, I can't shut up, so I'm telling her about every little bit of
Okay,
information that I
so
get.
all
So
the way
she's coming
through.
along the whole way. Yeah, I mean, she's the whole time. She's like, "Oh, that's really interesting." And if she thinks she can poke a hole, she tries. And then I see if I can answer the question by doing more studying. And then we talk about it. And she's been coming along the whole way. This wasn't like I just up and one day was like, "Hey, we're going to be Mormons." It was more so as like she was aware of the process as it was occurring.
Okay, all right. And she's all on board as you
Yeah.
guys are figuring this out.
Yep.
So you're like, okay, Mormonism's true. What's your first action after that? Do you reach out to the LDS missionaries? What
Yep.
do you do?
So I didn't reach out to the missionaries. I got a hold of the bishop
Okay.
and I went to the local LDS church. And I think we went for a total of like 3 meetings, but we
Okay.
had a very bad experience. And so I realized that wasn't it.
What was bad about it?
There was lots of things. So first of all,
I'm
one
and
of the
I'm not asking to bash the LDS church,
no, 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 no. Yeah,
right?
I totally agree. Like I just said, these are my brothers in the restoration. So like
Right.
I don't have hostility. I don't intend to be
Yeah.
insulting towards Russell Nelson, none of that kind of thing. This is just the way I think. So there were some doctrines that made a lot of sense to me.
Okay.
The idea that, we are all brothers and sisters with heavenly parents, the eternal progression to godhood, the plurality of gods, but only one that we care about, multiple levels of the celestial kingdom, the idea that there's only one unforgivable sin. North America is the land of promise, the gathering of Israel, the importance of temple worship, plural marriage. I mean, at the time, right? Remember, see, you had a podcast with our good friend Michael Ness, and you said, the church kind of controls the independent Book of Mormon study groups. It sort of tries to say, hey, here's how you should study the Book of Mormon. And you made a comment that, man, if we did, independent Bible study the way the Baptists do, only we did independent Book of Mormon study, you'd make a lot of fundamentalists. And that's exactly what I did. I mean, I just kind of studied all this independently. And then, so to me, like, 132 and plural marriage, I can see that. So the way that I had read it was not so much that plural marriage was, because if it depends on how you read it and all that kind of thing. But the way that I got it, at least at first, was that plural marriage was not an explicit commandment for everybody, but if you were commanded to do it, then you must do it. And it is not a bad thing, and it is not a sin. And to me, that seemed very logical. But the church had an issue with plural marriage, and when I went to the LDS church, a lot of these hard hitting, differentiating doctrinal truths that make Mormonism so fundamentally different from the rest of Christianity in such an important way, you didn't hear them.
Right.
You'd hear these talks from people, and you might get a little hint here and there of some of these, sort of more edgy doctrines, but the real meat and potatoes felt like it was missing. It kind of felt like the way the LDS church was presenting themselves, and this could be just this church, I don't know, was we're pretty much Protestants with the third book. And I just, it wasn't it for me, man. And then the other thing that I didn't like is right around this time I went to Utah. So my wife's parents, they moved to Utah, and they're not Mormons. They just, in fact, I don't even think they really like Mormons very much. I think they're uncomfortable with the fact that we're Mormons. But they moved to Utah. I don't know, maybe they're just gluttons for punishment. But so they moved to Utah, and we went to go visit, and we went to BYU just to walk around the campus. And I really like plants, so I wanted to see the trees. Colleges always do a great job of planting weird
Sure.
trees on campus. And so we're walking around and we're exploring. And one of the things that I noticed is like all the young guys are all kind of dressed the same, and nobody's got beards, and they've all got really similar haircuts. And I start reading that like Russell Nelson has said, or I guess, before him, whoever the guy was before him, but they said like when you go to BYU, here's the rules and here's what and like there's an official Mormon, like guidance from the president on having a beard. And I remember thinking, like, this sort of feels like the authoritarianism that I had experienced in the Catholic Church in the beginning. Like, I really don't think God cares if I've got a beard. I think
Right.
he's going to care a lot more about what kind of person was I? And did I really seek to build the kingdom of Zion on earth? And did I perform the ordinances? And did I do my best to find a valid priesthood lineage or priesthood authority lineage? And like these kinds of things, right? Like that's what God's going to care about. I don't think God is going to care that I've got a beard, like that just doesn't seem like the thing I'm worried about. I feel like there's some bigger fish to fry. And I mean, Porter Rockwell was a Mormon, like really? But so anyway, so um,
Namesake of the university
yes.
had a completely killer beard.
Yeah, 100%, like Brigham Young, and I mean all of them back then. And so, like it just felt like they were worried about the wrong stuff, and the message was watered down.
Mhm.
Like Like when you read a W.W. Phelps song, like the lyrics to a W.W. Phelps hymn
Yes.
or an Eliza Snow hymn, like that is hard hitting. Like if I could hide to Kolob,
Blow your mind.
dude, there's not even words to describe how hard hitting something like that is.
Do
I
you
mean,
like that song?
oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, there's a dude named Tom Bennett who
Okay.
is a professional musician,
Okay.
also a fundamentalist. He does a killer rendition. You can find it on YouTube. You need to go
Okay.
scope it out.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the listeners. I'm going to take 2 seconds of typing to write this down. You said it's Tom Bennett.
Yep. If you could hire to collab.
Okay. All right. Sorry to
Sorry.
anybody that heard
Shout
Tom
out to
Bennett
Tom
reference.
Bennett. But yeah, no. Killer rendition. You need to listen to it.
Well, yeah, and so like when you read the stuff that William W. Phelps and Eliza Snow they put into these hymns, you're just like, this is different, man. Like this is not
Yep.
milk toast Christianity. This is a different thing. And that's what made it so substantive, because so many of those doctrines that are differentiators are not just like contrarian and weird, but they make such sense.
Yep.
And when you go to a church and you don't get a lot of that out of the LDS church, and then you
Yep.
also get this authoritarianism, it just didn't sit right with me. And then there was really two experiences that kind of got us. And this all happened in like 4 weeks. I mean, it happened really quickly. We went there because I didn't even know. The only thing I knew about fundamentalists was I knew about Warren Jeffs. And I didn't realize that like fundamentalists dislike that guy more than anybody. But I
Oh,
just thought that fundamentalists they were all Warren Jeffs people. And so that's not
sure.
me, because that guy's a creep. And so I didn't know anything about like, you know, the uh oh shoot, what's the name? The righteous branch, or
Oh yeah,
the Nielsen Nailers,
yeah,
or
the brand. Yep.
the AUB. I didn't know about any of this stuff. I was just like, I mean, the LDS church, that's where the people that like the Book of Mormon go. And so I like the Book of Mormon. I believe in this. And so I guess we all believe the same thing. So I'm going to go there. And that was kind of like the extent of my logic. So I go, and the message was watered down. Like I said, a lot of these really hard hitting doctrines were not there. And, there was this sense of authoritarianism, but then there was two things that really got me. One is they said, look, you got to talk to these missionaries, got to talk to these missionaries. So they had sister missionaries at that ward.
Mm-hmm.
And when I spoke to the sister missionaries, I didn't let them come to my house because I was a little skeptical. And when I spoke to them, they had almost like these manufactured personalities. Like the way they spoke was almost like they were reading out of a script book.
Right.
And I would ask these questions that really mattered to me, like for example, I had said to you that I thought that if you sort of explore mentally your natural inclinations, you can infer something about the nature of existence. And I
Right.
think there's value in that, right? But there's a way to do that. Like you wouldn't just be like, well, I have sexual impulses and so I should be extremely promiscuous. Like that's not really a good
Right.
line of reasoning. Like there's a certain way to do that. And so one of the passages that I had a lot of trouble with was, I think it's Mosiah 3:16, the natural man is an enemy of God. And I remember asking the question, hey, like when I really think about the kind of things that I am naturally sort of designed to do, the things that seem right, if I think about the lineage of human existence, I have a conflict of understanding with this passage. Now, since then, I've reconciled it and I understand it now. It makes sense to me. But at the
Sure.
time, I had a conflict of understanding. And I would say, so can you make this make sense? I don't think I ever got a good answer to that or any of the questions that I asked. So that was the first thing. The next thing was early on, I read about Adam God. And that clicked for me too, because if you read about Adam God, see the people get confused, okay? They think that Adam God is like wild and different. First of all, a lot of people in the LDS church have never even heard of this. Like there are
Right.
so many people in the LDS church that don't even know this was ever a teaching. But the other thing that makes the Adam God doctrine so insanely powerful is it's not really that Adam is the father. I mean, I'm not saying that's not true. What I'm saying is that's not the hard-hitting part. That's not the part that gets you. The part that gets you is that he was the father in an infinite succession of eternal fathers that all did the same thing that lead you to the same point in the process of the eternal progression to godhood.
Right.
Like if Lorenzo Snow's axiom that as God now is, or as God once was, man now is, and as God now is, man may be. If that is true, then Adam God is necessary. You
Yep.
have to have that doctrine. You can't not have that doctrine. And I found out about that early on because I was trying to make sense of this. And when I found out about that, I that's when I found out about what's in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith about how the term in the very beginning of Genesis is Elohim, which would mean God's plural.
Yep.
And later it's, Yahweh and Jehovah and Adonai and all. I guess Yahweh and Jehovah is the same thing, but Yahweh and Adonai and, all these other names.
Sure.
And I thought that was very interesting. And so I asked them, I said, so what does this mean? Like when the Elohim says, let us make man in our image, who's talking? And if Elohim is different than Jehovah, then who's Jehovah? And the only answer that they could ever give me was Jehovah's Jesus Christ, which it never made any sense to me. Now, Drew Briney one time, and I had this conversation with Drew Briney, and he tells me that, you could think about Jehovah as an office. And he said that the early brethren, at least some of the early brethren, and I'm probably going to screw this argument up. So, Drew, if you hear this, I apologize for misrepresenting your views, but I'm going to do my very best. But they seemed to have believed, he argued, in the early brethren seemed to have believed in this kind of like this concept, which could sort of be visually represented by the 6-point star, right? You get a triangle up and you get the
Right.
triangle down of a creation Godhead and a salvation Godhead.
Right.
And in this idea of the salvatory Godhead, Jesus may well occupy the office of Jehovah because Jehovah is an office. It's not a name, it's a title. And, I mean, think about it, right? I mean, that doesn't seem that crazy. Like, and this sort of lines right up with the idea that there's a plurality of gods, but only one that we care about. Because think about your kids. Your kids
Right.
call you dad. They say dad. Dad. And the guy next door, he's a dad. And the guy over there, he's a dad. But
Yep.
they don't call him dad because they've only got one dad that they're worried about.
Right.
And it's the exact same thing in this concept, either with the name God or the title Jehovah. And so it didn't make sense to me that Moses was praying to Jesus in the Old Testament. I just went, I don't think that jives. And so I asked some questions to the missionaries, and I never told them where I lived. Keep this in mind, okay? I would call them and I would ask these questions, and they never had a good answer. Well, one day I come home and I find on my doorstep a list of the names of God in the Bible. And it wasn't what they meant. It was literally just a list. So it was like fairly intellectually bereft. There wasn't really anything there. It was just a list. I could have gone through the Bible and made a list myself, but it was
Gotcha.
just a list. And I went, how did this get here? And my wife goes, I bet you it was the missionaries. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me, right? Like they went and found out where I lived and then dropped a list of biblical names. Like there's no way. And so I called them and I said, did you come to my house? And they were like, yeah. What? Like, who gave you permission to do that? Oh, well, we found out where you lived from one of the members and all this stuff. And I told him, I said, with all due respect, you knew that I had never invited you to my house, and that was for a reason. It was because I was keeping distance until I was more comfortable with this. And I feel like you knew that, and there was a reason you didn't call and say, hey, can I come over? You just did it on the sly, which tells me that you were afraid to have that conversation. And so you're not only not welcome to come back, you're also not welcome to call me anymore. And that was it. We just never went to the LDS church again.
Wow. What'd you guys do next? Right. Cause now it must feel like you cut off the only avenue to Mormonism, right?
So I had a hunch that there was more to it because of Drew Briney's book. So I still didn't know anything about I knew about the Adam God teachings. because I'd read Adam God Teachings by Drew Briney. And if you don't own that book and you're a Mormon fundamentalist, or I should say an OG Mormon, I don't necessarily like the term fundamentalist, you should read that book. And if you haven't, and if you have read it, you should probably just read it again because it will make you smarter. But so Drew Briney had that book and I had read that book. And so I reached out to Drew. I found his contact information some kind of way. I don't even remember how I did it, but I did. And I said, hey man, like, how do I find people that believe this kind of thing? And he says, well, oh, you know what? It wasn't Drew. I'm sorry. It was Kevin Kraut because I had read
Okay.
Ogden Kraut's books, called Pioneer Press, got a hold of Kevin. Kevin and I started to form a friendship. I visited him in Utah when I went to go visit my wife's parents. Then I read Drew Briney's book, and then I said, hey, Kevin, do you know Drew? And he says, yeah, here's his contact information. And then he gave it to me. So I reached out to Drew. That was when I got introduced to Sean Anderson, Moroni Jessup, Michael Ness. These guys are some of my best friends now. I mean, I really love all those guys. But
Right.
at the time, that was when I started to learn, like, oh, there's other people in Mormonism. And by the way, if you've never seen this before, I encourage all of the people that are listening to go on Wikipedia and look up branches of the Restoration, I think branches of Mormonism or something. There's someone that made a graphic of all of the different splits in the history of Mormonism, and there are a lot of groups, and they're not necessarily all fundamentalists. Some of them are because like they come out of that sort of branch that Lauren,
Right.
of the work and Lauren Woolley and all that kind of thing. But there's all kinds of other ones.
Yep.
And so I encourage anybody to go on Wikipedia and go find that because it is an absolutely fascinating depiction of how things have split off. And I didn't understand that at the time. I understood it very quickly once I started talking to Sean and to Moroni and to Michael. And then that's when I found out that, oh, there's all these groups. There's the AUB and there's the Peterson people and there's the Nielsen Nailers and there's the Kingstons and the LeBarons and there's all these people and they all got a nickname. And we must love nicknames in this world, right? But so then I figured, okay, well, one of these people's got to be onto something. And then that's when I found out that actually there's this strain of Mormonism that is full of people that don't really regard themselves as being members of any group and they're independent. And at that point, that was kind of when I was like, okay, this is me because so our family is baptized in and goes to church with when we're near a church in Brownsville, Texas. We're not near one, but we hold the meetings at home here. But when we're near a church, we go to a church that belongs to the Nielsen Nailers, people you'd call the Nielsen Nailers, the
Mhm.
Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the Kingdom
Good
of God.
folks. Good folks.
And
I've
yeah,
had
great.
Steve Johnson on. Great guy.
Yep. Great guy. One of my very favorite people. And some just absolute like titans of gospel understanding in that world. Jeff Wall is a guy that if you ever have the ability to get on your podcast, you should, because first of all, if there's anyone that I have ever in my life, I don't have many brothers. If there's anyone I have ever felt like was a brother to me, it would be Jeff Wall. But also, I think I've learned more from that guy than him and Michael Ness than probably any two people that I have spent time around. Taylor Smith is also really smart, and I mean, there's just some guys that are in that orbit that are just giants in terms of their
Yeah.
understanding. And so we are baptized by the members of that priesthood group. But I actually I differ from probably some of the other members of that group in that I regard myself as independent. I regard myself because the way that I think about it is like this: I accept their claims to priesthood authority. I think that they are doing the work to build the kingdom of Zion in a righteous way. I think that they are effective in that work. I think that they are good people. I think that they have kept many of the most important traditions alive. I think that it's the right place for us to go to church and to meet and to develop connections and to receive the ordinances and all of those kinds of things. But if one day, the guy that's in charge, or they don't really have a specific guy that's in charge, they have a council that presides. But if the council starts doing weird stuff, I'm bye-bye. I am not beholden to, I'm not on a team here, right? I'm
Right.
not playing a team sport. I am a Mormon, and I am beholden to the content of the scriptures. And so in some way, though we do go to church with them, I regard myself as, and my family as, independent Mormons. And once I had learned what that was and that that existed, that was kind of when it was just easy, because now the only thing I got to worry about is the content of the scriptures, man. Like what did the scriptures say? What did Joseph Smith tell us in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith? And then the secondary question is, what can I find in the other inspired books that I had mentioned all the way back in the beginning of this interview that tells me more about the eternal truths about which I desire to know something, you know?
Sure. So all through this process, did your wife, is she worried about like plural marriage? Is she worried about all this priesthood stuff? Is there anything there that's because so often some of this can actually tear families apart,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so
So
how are you broaching those subjects?
so her and I have had a very like open dialogue based relationship since we first met. And as you can probably tell, any of your listeners, from 2 hours of me talking, I don't got much of a filter, and I'm pretty blunt when it comes to most things. And so for a long time before then, we had talked about all kinds of hot button moral issues, to include the idea that I don't think that a man having more than one wife is morally wrong at all. Right. And I think that the big problem is, yeah, I think the reason this tears families apart is there's a template that I've seen, particularly among converts, where guys will convert to fundamentalism, and then very quickly they get a revelation about, oh, I'm supposed to marry this other woman, which is
Yeah.
which is always, that's always a little suspect to me.
Hold on. I'm going to
Um,
give a public service announcement right here. If your first significant revelation in plural and in fundamentalism is I'm going to be a polygamist,
yeah,
you may want to check that.
yeah, you should probably, you might wonder if that revelation came from somewhere other than God.
Right.
But yeah, somewhere above your knee but below your waist. So anyway, so I would say that there's this pattern that I've seen where that happens, and I think that's what freaks women out. But my wife and I experienced this very obvious cosmic magnetism that brought the two of us together, like undeniable. Like it would have been um like it it would have been potentially catastrophic for us to have ignored those signs and to have opposed the current, or the cosmic magnetism, to use that term, that was bringing us together. And I think that we're both smart enough to know that if that ever happened again, that it's our obligation to enter the principle. But it doesn't mean that, like, to me, that's pretty low on my priority list, because I'm a guy. And I mean, come on, this is like one of the messiest commandments, because like, what
Yeah.
other commandment are you given that also happens to line up perfectly with this ancient impulse that is probably only uh less strong than the desire to breathe and eat and drink water, that, like, is hard to control already? Like, what other commandment lines up perfectly with an impulse like that, like with a drive like that, especially as a guy? And so my thought process is, I know what it feels like to be brought together with somebody, and if that happens again, I will know it, especially now that am I understand the way that, not, I don't want to say like I understand fully, but that I have a much better idea of the way that God talks to you and leads you together. And
Okay.
I think that my wife knows that too. Like, she knows that there's nothing to mistrust. This isn't like I'm going to go, man, I got to be a polygamist now, because that's not where my mind state is. And like I said,
Sure.
if I'm commanded to do it, I'm doing it. But I know what that feels like to be commanded to be with somebody, because I did it once. And if that happens again, I'll know it. But
Right.
to date, it ain't happening. And I'm sure that if it happens again, she'll know it too.
Yeah. Yep. No, she will. At least that's the way it was in my
Yeah,
circumstance.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, that's good. Um, So as you, what are the kids thinking about at this point, right? How old are your
Dude.
kids?
So, okay. So my oldest is 15. Then my next one is 9. Then I have a 5-year-old. I have like a one almost 2-year-old. And then I've got a newborn who's about 4 months old.
So you're spanning the gamut.
Yeah, dude. And I'm like 33, 34. I'm thinking I'm 34. It's 2024. I'm 34. So that means that probably got another 5 in there. And so eventually they'll probably span an even bigger range. But the oldest two are the two that understand enough to really have an opinion. And man, they make me feel like I'm a slothful servant. Like these kids just like they just eat this up. They, you know, they know like I don't know half the hymn book at this point by heart. I mean, and this whole journey only started 2 years ago, where we actually had
Right.
read the Book of Mormon and began any of this. They
It
both read
accelerates quickly.
it does, yeah. So they both probably know half the hymn book by heart. They've both read the Book of Mormon cover to cover. They do Book of Mormon study every single day or Bible study every single day. My 9-year-old in particular, oh man, she just you want to talk about being like a proud parent. So we have a meeting every Sunday at our house. Okay. And so we'll open with a prayer and we'll do a song. I'm not much of a singer. So I kind of just, what I do is I put one on the television, like let's say like the Tabernacle Choir or
Sure.
something. And then my kids really like to sing along with it. And generally I'm spending more time like reading and analyzing the contents of the lyrics for the, sort of message inside. Then we'll do the sacrament and then we have like a discussion and then we'll close with a prayer. And when we do that, my 9-year-old, man, you want to talk about some hard hitting questions. This kid I have to write her stuff down because I'm like, we can't talk about this in the amount of time that I have right now. Like
Right.
I could write a book on this question. Like, and
Right.
she has just got a knack for that, man. Like she just asks these questions that I can't even begin to explain it to you. Like one time she says to me, this is coming from a 9-year-old. So if Adam is the Heavenly Father, then who was Adam praying to? And I was like, ooh,
Nice.
that's a good question. And
Nice.
like that kind of stuff. And she's 9, dude. Like so that's been really cool. And then my older one, she is like I said, she is just all in. So we went from no religion to like she's, more of a practicing Mormon than I am. Like she never forgets her prayers and she the way she dresses, like she chooses. This is by choice. This girl wears long dresses that are very modest all the time, and they're not like not
Very
like
cool.
FLDS like prairie dress types or anything like that. But she just has a very modest way of dress that she is very like religiously motivated to keep. I can't even get her. We live near the beach, 25 minutes away, and she just like can't figure out how to go because she doesn't have like a dress she can swim in. So she's just always uncomfortable if she goes to the beach. She's very modest in that way. She does, like I said, she's the one that really, really knows all the hymns and practices them and learns to sing them. She plays the hymns just on the television when she's doing things. She's read the Book of Mormon, maybe even twice. She's read the Bible. I mean, she's really, really like enthusiastic. And it's been this way for a while now. So I think it's got some staying power because if you know anything about teenagers, it's that a lot of times they've got enthusiasm for about like 20 minutes and then it
Right.
goes away. And hers has really stayed. So those two are the ones that are old enough to have an opinion on it. And I mean, they are as bought in as anybody. My ones that are a little younger, they're just not really old enough to have an
No,
opinion.
they're
So,
along for the ride still.
yep.
Right. I mean, yeah, no, dude, that's awesome. All right. So today that leads you to Brownsville, Texas, and you're just out there doing your thing.
Yep. Basically. So we moved to Missouri because, like I said, there's a lot of really good stuff that's going on in Missouri. And I had thought that it was the place that we were supposed to be. And when we landed there, I'm not even gonna get in all the details. One thing after another, like really big, catastrophic, disorderly things happened to our family over and over. And we
Anything to do with
are
the religion?
no, not so much. the religion as much as just things in life that made it
Okay.
extremely difficult to get settled. So, to any of your listeners that don't know me, which would probably be all of them, if you did know me personally, one of the things that you would know is that my wife and I have a very orderly, very methodical, very calculated way of existing in the world. Come into our house, it's always very clean. Things are in a good spot. In fact, I actually have a wooden plaque when you walk into my door, and it says, "Mine house is a house of order, not a house of confusion."
Mhm.
And so that, I mean, that's the way that we are, and it's always been the way that we've been. When we went to Missouri, everything, everything became a jumbled and persistent mass of disorganized chaos, and it didn't relent, and it happened for 9 straight months. And it was it was the it got to the point where, so at first my interpretation was, wow, the adversary really doesn't want us here, so like we're gonna fight hard to do some good work. But then we got baptized when we first landed in Missouri. So this is, I don't know, about a year and a half ago or something. And given the gift of the Holy Ghost, and I started to get this impression that, hey, wait a minute, I don't know if this is the adversary. I think maybe we're fighting against the plan for us. Like this something doesn't feel right about this. And my wife started to get the same impression. And we started to pray on it, and praying more and praying more and praying more and asking God for an answer. And eventually we got an answer in the form of an experience that we both had. It wasn't like a vision or something. It was just like a regular life experience, but it was almost like the life experience was orchestrated in a way. Have you ever seen a movie where like something that happens to the main character is very obviously supposed to tell the main character something about like his existence?
Yeah.
Like the setting, like the thing that happened is supposed to be the message.
Yep.
Well, that's what happened. We had one of those. And it was very obvious that the experience was the message. And it came at the climax of us just begging for an answer. And at that point, we said, look, we got to get out of here. And I'm not one of these fundamentalists that thinks that Missouri is cursed and the yellow dog prophecy and all these kinds of things. I just, for some reason, Lord didn't want us in Missouri at that time. And ever since we left and came here, and it's kind of a long story how we wound up here, but ever since we came here, things have gone back to their orderly and methodical ways, and things are, I am more convicted in the work that I have to do than I have ever been. And I think all of my family members are.
Yeah. I was going to say, sometimes we look at places we land that we don't stay at for a long time as a mistake,
Yep.
right? I don't tend to look at it that way. Normally, you're supposed to get something there
Yep.
and then you're moving on, right? In your case,
Yep.
it was probably some ordinances, right? You show up, you get baptized,
Yep.
you get a flavor for the culture a little bit and maybe some hard-hitting doctrine. And
Yep.
and then it's almost and I'm not going to speak for you, right? I mean, you can do that. You can go get that from God, but I can imagine that maybe it was just like, okay, now go out in the mission field.
Well,
Right?
and it's great by being there. I met Michael Ness, and I met Sean Anderson and Jeff Wall, and I met Al Williams, well, you and I met, and like, I mean, it's just like I made so many important personal connections that the time spent there was absolutely valuable. But I just wasn't supposed to stay there. My family wasn't supposed
Yeah.
to stay. And it got to the point where even my oldest daughter, okay, who had made all these friends, and so she's really, enjoying her time in Missouri, and she's got friends and stuff, and she doesn't want to leave her friends. Even she's going, Dad, I think we got to get out of here. Like it
Yeah.
was, I mean, everybody it was just obvious.
Sure. And look, again, these sorts of things are extremely personal.
Mm.
I would imagine that before long you'll make an impact out there in Texas too, right?
Let's hope.
And I've always told people when people found out I was moving to Missouri, they said, "Well, where, wonder where I should go." I'm like, "Wherever the Lord tells you."
Yep.
If he tells you to set up shop in the place that seems most counterintuitive, you better set up shop in that spot because he knows
Yeah,
where you're supposed to be.
for sure.
Um,
I mean, he made Lehi wander through the desert for however many years, and they didn't even know where they were going.
Right.
I mean, that
Exactly.
was just like, hey, go out there and wander, and you'll figure it out.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. All right. So that pretty much takes us to today. So now let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask you two questions here. If you could go back in time and you could have a meeting with the younger you, what would you tell that guy?
That's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. Sorry for the silence.
No, it's good. Don't worry about that. Take all the time you need.
You're not as smart as you think you are. That's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You think you've got it figured out, and you don't. You
Right.
don't have it figured out. Because now that I've got way more figured out than I did back then, I realize that actually that's still an incredibly small percentage of the things to
Right.
figure. Like I'm still really not figuring a lot out, you know?
Dude, I'm right there with you. Like the more the more I learn, the more I'm like, I'm a moron, right?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
And but I think it's supposed to kind of be that way, right? And I think that's one of the beautiful truths within Mormonism is you're never done. You're
Nope.
never done. You're never
Nope.
finished. You're going to keep going through this process as you progress and as you proceed, both in this life and the next.
Yep.
Um, I once heard someone say, the closer I get to Christ, the more his divinity illuminates my shortcomings.
That's a
Right.
great way to put that. I like that. Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and,
That's
and
good.
I think that's 100% true. Right. The closer we get
Yep.
to the Savior, the more we're like, oh crap, I didn't see that there. Right. And
Yep.
I gotta fix this now. And
Yep.
that's good. That's a good thing. Right. And though, rather than something that should, as you put it earlier in the podcast, rather than something that should inspire shame or excessive guilt, that should be a motivation, right? You should look
Yeah.
at that and just be like, well, there's one more thing I got to get done, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
and so often I think we get hyper fixated on where we're going, and that's good. You got to know where you're going. But sometimes we forget to enjoy the ride,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And if so much of the gospel is teaching us how to enjoy the ride even here, right?
Yep.
We talked about the Adam God doctrine. One of the things I love is all of a sudden God has proximity to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's not just my spiritual father, but he's my earthly father in some, in a lot of ways.
So Michael Ness put it this way. He said the central question of Mormonism is who is God? How did he become God? And how do we become like him? And like to me, that's like that sums up everything you just said. What is that journey? Because the
Yep.
fact that that's even possible, by the way, for those that don't know, this is something that was actually pretty openly spoken about among early Christians. Like Irenaeus,
Yep.
said this explicitly. And now the modern Christian traditions would I mean, the closest thing you get is in the Orthodox Church, there's this concept of theosis or oneness with God, but it's still different than progression to godhood. But the remnant is there. And like you're exactly right. This is the beauty of Mormonism is that it's an eternal process that literally does not end. Matter is eternal.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you this question. What has been the bulk of your experiences in dealing with other fundamentalists?
Um, well, for one thing, fundamentalists, and I'm going to be a little bit disparaging here because I think that fundamentalists could use this message broadly. Fundamentalists are really caught up in a lot of like fundamentalist drama. Like I noticed that, different groups have different ways of thinking about other groups, and that's a valid temple that is God's work, but this one isn't. And man, they're just too hung up on that. I think that really the right way to think about this is that as long as somebody is trying their very best, everyone is probably operating with a degree of inspiration. And that degree of inspiration is probably, I won't say probably, that degree of inspiration could well be less than your inspiration or less than the inspiration of your group. But you don't know what God is doing with those people. You don't know what plans the Lord has for them. What you do know is that they are members, they are brothers in your Mormon tradition. They're brothers in the restoration. And so, like I think about like really controversial groups in fundamentalism, like the second book of commandments people, for example. go read that stuff, like there's inspiration in that too. And there may be, you might be the kind of person that thinks that group of people is evil for this reason or that reason, or they're being run by an evil guy or whatever it is. But I think it was, someone told me this was a Brigham Young quote, and I've never read it, but it was something to the effect of like, I've only ever benefited from accepting the 99 truths that the devil gives me and rejecting his one lie. And so even if the people that are not members of your group are, in that analogy, the devil, right? To use that analogy, they still are probably, as brothers in Mormonism, as brothers in the Restoration, going to have a lot of inspired truths that you can learn something from, because you don't have it all figured out and you don't know what God's doing with other people. And at the end of the day, think about it like this. Say you have a kid and your kid grows up and they're not a member of your group. Wouldn't you rather that they married into like another fundamentalist group, or like, I don't know, the
Right.
LDS church or something, than like, I don't know, go be like a liberal atheist that lives in Washington, D.C.? Like, wouldn't that be better?
Yeah.
And that tells you something about Mormonism as a whole. So I think that would be one thing that I would say I have learned in dealing with fundamentalists is people have the wrong mindset about like teams. Now, the good thing that I would say about fundamentalists, because I can say a lot of good things, is, man, there are some good people in this work, and they're also really normal. And that's probably the biggest thing. So my buddy Jeff Wall, his wife comes up to me and she says to me one day after we had touched down in Missouri, and she knew we were converts from totally not Mormon, like a not Mormon
Right.
background. She says, "So was this a little bit of a culture shock?" And I thought about it for a minute, and I was like, no, it wasn't. And she looks at me and she's like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah, actually, it really just feels like we figured out where all the normal people were hanging out this whole time."
Right.
Because like in this world of weirdness, and in a world that denies obvious, real, objective truths in the name of making people feel good about themselves, like, to find a group of people like fundamentalists that are just perfect grounded in the frank and real principles of the gospel. Plain language is a Mormon is a Mormon principle, right? Like, this stuff is written in plain language. And to find people that are grounded in that, it just feels like, oh, okay, this is an island of normalcy in a torrential sea of chaos. And that was, I think, the greatest thing that I took from meeting fundamentalists.
Dude, I couldn't agree with you more. Like the first time I started meeting with fundamentalists, and I'm ashamed to admit this now, I went strapped, right? I'm like, okay, if I gotta shoot my way out of here, so be it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
we'll figure this out. Now, to my surprise though, right? Because really my exposure to fundamentalists had been Warren Jeffs to that point,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And really my first two encounters with, and I'm not going to name names, but my first few encounters with fundamentalism, that first go round I have, man, I met some guys who just flat scared the crap out of me.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm like, crap. Like, I really didn't want to even be LDS, but now I seem to be going deeper in this. Right.
Mhm, mhm.
And I was so surprised. And I feel ashamed that I was this surprised because I should have known better. Right. But I didn't.
Yeah. So this gets at this thing I've been hitting at that we've been talking about, which is the term fundamentalist. I don't
Right.
like this. I don't like this term. And I get like why we use it. It's kind of a tradition, but I don't like the term. And the reason that I don't like the term is because we don't really actually disagree with almost anybody in the restoration on the fundamentals: baptism, repentance, um, like, learning the principles of the gospel, the Book of Mormon, like the fundamentals. We kind of all agree on those. That's not actually where we disagree. Where we disagree is on like doctrines of deeper understanding, or on the higher laws. So first of all, it doesn't fully capture the reason that we are split. Second of all, fundamentalist is literally the name of the group that Warren Jeffs ran.
Right.
Third, in an effort to be more PC, the LDS Church has recently announced that the term Mormon is not the proper term anymore, which means that that is an orphan term. And so I think we should reclaim it. And
I
I
do
think
too.
we should say the saints or the LDS, those are the people that belong to the church, and the Mormons are the people like us. We're not fundamentalists, of course. Everyone in the Restoration is a fundamentalist. We all agree on the fundamentals, but we're Mormons. We're Mormons. We're the people that have the original doctrines.
You know, couple friends of mine, shout out to Ben Schaefer and one to Michael Ness. Ben Schaefer likes the term Orthodox Mormon.
Yeah.
Michael Ness likes the term Pioneer Mormon. I think both of those would be good alternatives, and I agree with you that Warren's done a number on that. But
Well, and what people don't realize outside of this is that the people that dislike Warren the most, other than like the actual like fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is the fundamentalists. Like
oh
we're
yeah,
the ones that dislike the guy. Wait, trust me. As much as Joe on the street doesn't like Warren Jeffs, I promise you, your average person worshiping at the at the AUB meeting house in Bluffdale dislikes Warren more than that guy. I promise. Like it's people don't realize that. They think that there's like a connection, and there is, but only in terms of history. Like the actual, real sentiments of people in fundamentalism towards Warren is like, hell no.
yeah, no, he's made all of our lives significantly harder,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, absolutely. But back to the original point, I was amazed at how normal everybody
Mm-hmm.
was,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that I think is the big barrier for a lot of folks who explore this line of thought, right? Is like, I think my wife's hotter without the prairie dress. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Um, or gosh, I just can't see doing it the way that it's done, right? And that's the only thing they got is just what's given to them on the news with Warren Jeffs and all the
Yep.
craziness,
Yep.
the Laffertys, Ervil, right? You do have some bad actors there, right? But 99.9% of us are fairly normal. We have jobs, we get up, we do those jobs, our kids are educated. Um, I remember when I lived in Utah and someone said, well, how many fundamentalists do you think you are? I was like, I guarantee you work with somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Probably
guarantee
do.
you work with somebody or you work with somebody who knows them.
I would say to any of the LDS members listening, if you knew all of the companies that were contracted to build your temples, you might know how closely you are connected to fundamentalists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so it was one of those things that I was ashamed that I was shocked at, to be right honest with you, how normal everyone was. But I think that's a barrier for a lot of folks. And I think that's something that just needs to be said.
Yep.
Um, there's a learning curve to it for sure. But in my experience, 99% of all fundamentalists have been like, no, 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 you're okay. Come over here and we'll talk this out
Mhm.
and see if this makes
Yep.
sense, right?
Yep.
It's not it's not someone trying to lord it over you. It's not somebody trying to tell you how bad you've been. It's a
Mm-mm.
welcoming community,
Yep.
and most folks who live a fundamentalist way of life just want to do their part and help out,
I
right?
have never had anything but welcoming experiences from basically everybody.
Yep, absolutely.
I did go to an AUB meeting one time, and there was one guy that like was very clearly not happy that I was there. But
Right.
every other person was like, "Oh, hey, what's your name? And where'd you come from? And what are you doing here?" And like in a very like genuinely interested and friendly way.
Yeah,
And that, I mean, that's the only dude I can think of was that guy.
yeah,
And then I found out later that that's the group from which like a lot of these reality TV guys came. And so then they would get people coming in. They were like, oh, well, I want 5 wives, so I'm gonna join this group. And it's
right.
like, well, okay, I get why you might have been a little skeptical of the outsiders. You know what I'm saying?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Well, dude, good stuff. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to?
Um, I mean, I can't think of anything. I think, yeah, I mean, you're pretty good at asking questions. So I feel like I've kind of exhausted like the entire story. Like if you
I
just transcribed this into a book, I feel like it would basically be my autobiography.
I could get you a transcription.
I don't need it. I know the biography.
Well, can I print it for you? I mean, publish it for you? I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
Um,
sure. You can, you know, you can publish it and take the royalties too. It's all yours.
No. I'm just playing. Dude, I think you're an awesome guy. I love talking to you. We've talked before off the podcast, and I do. I think you're a great guy. I can't wait to see what the Lord has in store for you, because I think you're gonna do some great things.
Thanks, man. I don't think I'm that great. I think that I am excited to see what the Lord has in store for me. And I think what you're doing with this podcast is like, it really matters, because there are people that are going to hear this that are going to say, these people are normal, just like we talked about. And when that happens, that's when the converts come. And I think there's a point of inflection that is coming in the LDS church
I
sooner rather than later, when
I
they
do too.
marry a male couple in the temple. That is going to make a lot of people go, I'm having a faith crisis. And when people have a faith crisis, they're going to go one of two ways. They are either going to become fundamentalists, or they are going to leave entirely.
Yep. Christina Rossetti has often said, when you when you start picking up the Journal of Discourses and you read them seriously, you've only got two options, which is to not be Mormon at all, or start heading the fundy way. So
Yep.
awesome. Well, dude, that was good stuff. Hang out for 5 minutes. Just talk to you for a few off the air if you're good with that.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.